The rift did not open the way stories say rifts open. Not neat, not clean, not a doorway drawn by some careful hand. It tore. It tore the way a wound tears when the stitches meant to hold flesh together finally give up the fight. And what came through it, came through screaming with the color of old bruises. Green shot through with black, edges guttering like a torch in a gale. Rexxar felt it before he saw it. He had spent enough decades on enough battlefields to know the particular silence that comes before the world does something it was never meant to do. The way the air goes thin. The way even Misha's low, constant growl cut off mid-breath. He had been mid-swing, his axe already committed to a downward arc through the collarbone of a burning legion fellhound, when the world simply stopped agreeing to be the world. There was no falling sensation. There was no sense of motion at all. There was only the tearing, and then there was stone. Wet, black stone, older than anything Rexxar had ever put a boot to, and cold, in a way Azeroth's caves had never been cold, a damp that seemed to come from the rock itself, rather than merely sit upon it. He staggered, axe still raised from a swing that had nothing left to complete, and the fellhound was gone. And the burning plains of that half-remembered battlefield were gone, and in their place was a ceiling so high above him that his torchlight, someone's torchlight, sputtering somewhere behind him, couldn't find it. "Report," he said, out of old habit, before he even had his footing. The answer came in pieces, in coughs and curses and the particular groan of Bane Bloodhoof getting his considerable bulk upright on stone that didn't want to hold still beneath him. Rexxar counted voices the way he'd counted them 1,000 times before a charge. Bane's low rumble, Rokan's rapid Zandali muttering that was equal parts prayer and profanity, the dry rattle that was Kalia Menethil clearing dust from a throat that didn't strictly need to breathe, Lorthamar's clipped Thalassian command already trying to organize a perimeter, and beneath it all, Gazlo's high, delighted cackle. Because of course the goblin's first reaction to being torn out of reality was delight, not fear. "We're not on Azeroth," Bane said. It wasn't a question. The tauren chieftain had planted his staff into the stone and gone very still, the way he did when he was listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. "The land here, it does not know me. I cannot feel the spirits of this place." Or rather, he paused, and something in his broad face shifted, uneasy. "They are here, but they are strange to me. Old, hungry. Hungry works for me," Rokan said, already crouched low, twin blades out, dark eyes scanning the black beyond their torchlight. "Long as it ain't us they hungry for." Gazlo was already crouched over a jagged shard of the rift's edge, where it had scorched the stone floor. Goggles pulled down, muttering calculations to himself about fold density and arcane residue that nobody else in the party would understand, and nobody bothered asking him to explain. Lorthamar had his bow strung and an arrow knocked before Rexxar had even fully processed the shape of the cavern around them. Vast, ribbed like the inside of something that had once been alive, threaded with veins of pale blue crystal that pulsed faint light into the dark like a heartbeat too slow to trust. It was Kalia who said what none of the rest of them wanted to say first. "This is not a cave," she said quietly, tilting her pale face upward, studying the ribbed stone with an unsettling calm that came from having already died once and finding very little left in any world that could truly frighten her. "Caves do not breathe," and she was right. Rexxar felt it now that she'd named it, the faint, rhythmic exhale of the air around them, warm and cold in turns, a slow tidal pull that had nothing to do with wind. Somewhere far off, something vast shifted in its sleep, and the whole chamber trembled with it. Dust and grit sifting down from the ceiling none of their torches could reach. "We are inside something," Bane said, "or something is around us. I do not think there is a difference here." Misha whined low against Rexxar's leg, hackles raised, nose working the air in short, frightened pulls. That, more than anything, told Rexxar to trust his instincts. Misha did not spook at monsters. Misha had faced down worse things than anything Azeroth's wilds could throw at her across 2 decades at Rexar's side. Misha spooked at wrongness. And this place was wrong down in its bones. Wrong in a way that made the hair on Rexar's own thick arms stand up beneath the leather. Formation, Lorthamar said crisply, already falling into the discipline that had kept the Farstriders alive through 100 worse nights than this one. We don't know what's out there. We don't know what this place wants from us. We move together. We move careful. And Gazlo, he shot a glance sideways. You touch nothing without asking first. No promises, Gazlo said cheerfully, already 3 steps ahead of the group and peering at a crystal vein with undisguised hunger. They moved. And Orario's dungeon, 37 floors down in a chamber no adventurer of any familia had ever mapped, opened its throat and swallowed the sound of 6 strangers walking deeper into a world that had never once, in all its long and bloody history, had to reckon with anything quite like them. They found the first sign of something living a little under an hour later, and it was not what any of them expected. It was blood, dark, near black in the crystal light, spattered wide across a stretch of stone in the pattern Rexar's decades of tracking every kind of prey across every kind of terrain told him at a glance was a fight, and a bad one, and recent. He crouched, fingers brushing the edge of a print in the dust that was neither hoof nor boot nor claw exactly, but some strange hybrid, deep and dragging on one side, as though whatever made it had been wounded and still moving. Something came through here hurt, he said, and something else was chasing it, or hunting it, Rokan corrected, already following the drag mark with his eyes narrowed. Dear a difference. Chasing, you run from a fight. Hunting, he tapped the side of his own skull. That's a plan. They followed the trail, and the trail led them down through a narrowing passage where the ribbed stone gave way to something almost architectural. Carved arches, deliberate and old, the work of hands or claws that had shaped this place with purpose, rather than merely dwelling in what nature provided. Bane ran a broad palm along one wall as they passed and went quiet again, that same listening stillness settling over him. Someone built this, he said, or something, long ago. There is grief worked into this stone. I do not know how else to say it. They came out into a wider chamber, and that was where they found her. She, Rexar's instinct named the shape a she, before his mind had fully processed what he was looking at, and he never questioned that instinct afterward, was curled low against the base of a broken pillar, and she was not human, and she was not any beast Rexar had ever hunted across 2 worlds now. Her lower body coiled long and serpentine, dark-scaled, powerful even wounded. Her upper body was near enough to a woman's that it stopped every one of them cold. Arms wrapped around a second, smaller shape that lay motionless against her chest. Another of her kind, younger, barely more than a child by whatever measure her kind used for such things, and unmoving in a way that made Rexar's stomach turn to stone before he'd even registered why. She looked up as they entered, and her eyes were not a monster's eyes. Rexar had looked into the eyes of 1,000 creatures across his life that the world called monsters, and that he had learned, one by one, to call something closer to neighbor. Ogres who loved their children, dragonhawks who mourned their mates, beasts with more honor in them than half the men who'd hunted them for sport. He knew that look. He had spent his whole strange, orphaned life learning to recognize it in places the rest of the world refused to. Grief. Raw, animal, unmistakable grief. Layered over exhaustion. Layered over a fear so total, it had stopped being fear and become something closer to resignation. She did not attack. She did not flee. Could not. Rexar understood a beat later, seeing the deep gash torn along her scaled flank, black blood still welling slow and steady onto the stone. She only curled tighter around the small, still shape in her arms and bared teeth that could have taken a man's arm off at the shoulder. And the sound that came out of her throat was not a roar. It was a warning that was also, somehow, unmistakably, a plea. Come no closer. Please, come no closer. Behind Rexar, he heard Lorthamar's bowstring creak taut, the old Farstrider's instinct, unknown creature, wounded, cornered, dangerous, asserting itself before thought could catch up to reflex. Hold, Rexar said, and did not raise his voice, because he had learned long ago that the ones who needed calm the most were the ones least served by shouting. He kept his own axe low, angled to the ground, and took one slow step forward with both hands visible. Hold your shot, Rexar, Lorthamar started. She's not hunting anything, Rexar said. Look at her. Look at what she's holding. His voice dropped, gentled, the same register he used on wounded beasts, too far gone in pain to know friend from threat. She's not attacking us. She's protecting something, and whatever hurt her is probably still close. Bane had already lowered his staff, his broad tauren face unreadable but his stance entirely open, unthreatening, hands empty at his sides. The grief in this stone, he said quietly, almost to himself. It was hers, or her kind's. This has happened before, many times, I think. The serpent woman's eyes flicked between them, Rexar's slow advance, Bane's stillness, the bow still drawn in Lorthamar's hands, and something in her exhausted, wary posture shifted by a fraction. Not trust, not yet, but the particular calculation of a creature deciding, against every instinct screaming otherwise, whether these strange new shapes might be something other than the thing that had put the wound in her side. I'm going to kneel, Rexar said, to her as much as to his own party, and did, slow, axe set flat on the stone in front of him, both empty hands raised in the universal gesture he'd used on creatures across 2 worlds now, who had far more reason to distrust him than to trust him. I'm not here to hurt you, or the little one. For a long moment, nothing moved in the whole vast breathing dark of that chamber, except the slow drip of black blood onto stone. Then the serpent woman made a sound low in her throat. Not quite words, not quite anything Rexar's ear could parse into a language he knew, and shifted, just slightly, angling the small still shape in her arms toward him. Not offering, not yet, but showing. It was a child, or child-shaped at least, small, scaled, curled in on itself the way the injured curl, breathing too shallow and too fast. A wound along one thin arm crusted dark. Alive, Rexar breathed, relief loosening something in his chest he hadn't realized had gone tight. She's alive, just hurt. Rexar, Kalia's voice, quiet, urgent, from behind him. Something's coming. He heard it now too. The same low rumbling groan that had shaken dust from the ceiling earlier. Closer now, and beneath it, footsteps. Many footsteps, heavy, deliberate. The unmistakable rhythm of something that hunted in numbers. The serpent woman's whole body went rigid, and the sound she made this time needed no translation at all. Terror. How many? Bane asked, already turning, staff shifting in his grip to something closer to a weapon. Enough, Rokan said grimly, dark eyes fixed on the passage they'd come through, where the crystal light was beginning to catch on shapes moving low and fast through the dark. Many-legged, chittering, a whole pack of something converging on the sound and scent of fresh blood. And they ain't here for a chat. Rexar looked once more at the wounded creature curled protective around her child, at the exhausted, hopeless resignation in her eyes that said this was not the first time she'd faced this exact moment, and understood, with the sudden, total clarity of a man who had spent his entire life being told which creatures deserved a blade and which deserved a hand, and had long ago stopped trusting anyone else's answer to that question. precisely which side of this fight he was on. He rose, axe coming up off the stone in one smooth motion, and planted himself between the wounded mother and the sound of things converging in the dark. "Form up," he said, and this time there was no gentleness in it at all. "We're not letting them have her." Behind him, he heard Lorthamar's bowstring shift target, heard Bane's low chant beginning to build, felt Misha's growl return low and furious at his side. And for the first time since the rift had torn them out of one world and dropped them bleeding into another, Rexxar felt something almost like certainty settle over the whole strange, impossible situation. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know what waited beyond this chamber, what gods or kings or hungry things ruled whatever land had swallowed them. But he knew, with the same bone-deep instinct that had guided every choice of his life since the day the world first tried to tell him which side of the line between person and monster he belonged on, that whatever was coming through that passage was not going to touch this wounded woman or the child in her arms while he still had breath in his body. The chittering grew closer. The dark began, at last, to show teeth. And 37 floors above them, in a city that had spent 100 years building an entire civilization on the certainty of exactly where that line was drawn, nobody yet had the faintest idea that the ground beneath their feet had just changed forever. They came in a tide, and the crystal light caught them in flickers as they closed the distance. A swarm of Vuivra worker broods, low and segmented and quick. The kind of monster that hunted less by intelligence than by the sheer, drowning weight of numbers. And behind them, moving with a different and far more deliberate gait, something larger, something that had sent them. Rexxar didn't wait to identify it. He'd learned across 100 campaigns that the moment for identification was after the fighting, not during, and the first wave of chittering bodies was already breaking against the chamber's narrow mouth, like water finding the low ground. Lorthamar, high ground, thin the front line before they spread. He barked, and the Regent Lord was already moving, 3 fluid strides up a broken shelf of stone that put him above the swarm's reach, arrows loosing in a rhythm too fast for thought, each one finding a joint, an eye socket, the soft place beneath a chitinous plate where his Farstrider's training had taught him 100 years ago exactly where such creatures kept their vulnerabilities. Bane's staff came down against the stone with a crack that wasn't thunder but felt like it, and the totem lashed to its head flared with a low earth-brown light. The ground beneath the leading edge of the swarm buckled and rose in jagged spurs of stone, impaling 2 of the creatures outright, and sending a third tumbling backward into the ones behind it. "Day keep coming," Rokan shouted, already among them, twin blades ablur, moving with the low economical grace of a hunter who had killed more things in more shadows than he could easily count. He wasn't fighting like a man overwhelmed. He was fighting like a man thinning a herd, methodical even in the chaos, his shadow magic flickering black at the edges of each strike, disorienting, slowing, making the swarm's coordination fray at the seams. Rexxar planted himself directly in front of the wounded serpent woman and her child, and let the swarm come to him. There was a particular satisfaction, grim, old, familiar, in the weight of his axe meeting chitin, in the way 2 decades of hunting the worst that Azeroth's wilds could offer had trained his body to move without needing his mind's permission first. He was not a subtle fighter. He had never needed to be. He was an immovable wall of scarred green muscle and honed steel, and the Vuivra workers that reached him died fast, and the ones that didn't reach him at all learned, in the last half-second of whatever passed for thought in their small hungry minds, exactly why. Misha fought at his flank, bare claws raking through carapace, her low furious growl a constant undertone beneath the clash of steel and chitin. Behind him, he heard Kalia's voice rise in something that was not quite a war cry and not quite a prayer, Forsaken priests had their own strange relationship with the light, twisted and reclaimed from what had once tried to destroy them entirely, and what poured from Kalia's outstretched hands now was not holy in the way Azeroth's paladins would have recognized, but it burned through 3 of the swarm's number in a wash of pale fire regardless, and it steadied, Rexxar noted distantly, the wounded serpent woman's ragged breathing where it washed over her. She's healing them too. Of course she was. It was, Rexxar thought even mid-swing, exactly the kind of thing Kalia Menethil would do. Turn magic that Azeroth's dead had once used only for war, back into something closer to mercy, because mercy was the entire long, grinding argument of her whole afterlife. The larger shape arrived at the chamber's edge a moment later, and Rexxar finally got a clear look at it. Taller than a man, moving on 4 powerful legs with a long segmented tail arched to strike, mandibles the length of short swords clicking with a rhythm that was almost unsettlingly like speech. Not mindless, not merely hungry. This one was directing the swarm, and it fixed its many-faceted eyes on the wounded mother and child behind Rexxar's line, with an intent that needed no translation. "That's the one giving orders," Rokon called, already reading the same thing Rexxar had. "Take that one down, rest scatter." "Agreed," Rexxar said, and moved. The fight that followed was short and brutal, and entirely one-sided, in a way that would have surprised nobody who had ever watched Rexxar fight anything, anywhere. The Broodmother, because that was what it was, Rexxar understood with the particular clarity of a beastmaster's instinct, some hive-directing matriarch sent to reclaim or silence whatever the wounded serpent woman represented, was fast and strong and utterly unprepared for an axe swung by someone who had killed things twice her size, on a world that made Orario's dungeon look almost gentle by comparison. It ended with the Broodmother's segmented head parting from her thorax in a single arcing swing, black ichor spraying wide across already blooded stone, and the remaining swarm, bereft of whatever directing will had held them together, scattered into the dark in the particular panicked chaos of creatures suddenly, catastrophically leaderless. Silence fell, broken only by ragged breathing and the drip of blood, black and dark red both now, mingled on the stone, and the small, exhausted whimper of the child in the serpent woman's arms, stirring now, blinking open eyes that were, Rexxar saw as he lowered his axe and turned back toward her, every bit as frightened and every bit as intelligent as her mother's. "It's over," Rexxar said quietly, kneeling again, keeping himself low and unthreatening. "You're safe, for now at least." The serpent woman stared at him for a long moment, at the black edge dripping from his axe, at Misha's bloodied claws, at Bane and Rokon and Lorthamar fanning out to secure the chamber's edges, at Kalia's pale healing light still washing gentle over her wound, and something in her exhausted posture finally, fractionally, broke. She made a sound that Rexxar's ear, tuned across decades to the language of wounded and grieving things regardless of what shape they wore, understood perfectly, even without words. "Thank you." It was Gazlo, of all of them, who found the second trail, not of blood this time, but of tool marks, deliberate and recent, carved into a stretch of stone near the chamber's far wall, in a pattern too regular to be anything but writing. "Somebody's been through here," the goblin said, crouching low, goggles pushed up as he traced a gloved finger along the marks. Recent too, and whoever it was, they were in a hurry. See how the strokes get sloppier toward the end? Somebody was writing this while running. "Can you read it?" Bane asked. "Not a language I know," Gazlo admitted, which for Gazlo was practically a confession of failure. "But I know a warning mark when I see one. Whoever wrote this wanted somebody to know something bad happened here." Rexxar looked back at the serpent woman, who had gathered enough strength now, with Kalia's healing steadying her, to sit upright against the broken pillar, her child curled small and watchful in her lap. Her eyes had followed the conversation with an intensity that suggested she understood far more of their words than any of them had yet assumed. "You understand us," Rexar said. Not quite a question. Her head dipped, once, in something unmistakably like a nod. "Can you speak?" A long pause. Then, in a voice like stone grinding on stone, rough with disuse and pain, but unmistakably, deliberately shaped into words. "Yes." The whole party went very still. "Slow," she continued, each word visibly costing her effort. "Speech is not easy. For us, we learn, we try." Her clawed hand tightened protectively around her child. "You are not from the dungeon, not from Orario. What are you?" "We don't know where Orario is," Rexar said honestly. "We came through a tear in the world. We don't know this place at all. My name is Rexar. This is Bane, Rokan, Lorthamar, Kalia, and Gazlo. We're Horde. Or, we were, on the world we came from. I don't know what we are, here." Something shifted again in the serpent woman's exhausted expression. Not quite hope, but the ghost of something adjacent to it. "You fought for us," she said. "You did not know us, and you fought for us." "We know what it's like," Rexar said, "to be looked at and named a monster by people who never bothered to look closer. Most of us, all of us maybe, in one way or another." He glanced at Kalia, whose pale undead features carried their own long history of exactly that particular wound. At Bane, whose people the old human kingdoms of Azeroth had once hunted as savages. At Rokan, whose trolls had spent centuries fighting the same accusation. "We didn't need to know what you were called here, to know you didn't deserve what was hunting you." The serpent woman was quiet for a long moment, studying each of them in turn with an intensity that felt, Rexar realized, like someone recalibrating an entire understanding of the world in real time. "My name," she said finally, "is Vela. This is my daughter, Ilse. We are Xenos." She said the word with a particular weight, half pride and half old grief. "It means those who are not written into the guild's ledgers, those who think, who choose. The city above calls all who look like us monster. They kill us for it, even the ones of us who only wish to live, even children," Rexar said, looking at Ilse, and something hardened in his chest. "Even children," Vela confirmed, quiet and flat. "There are places, hidden places, where some of us live in secret, protected by a few who know the truth and choose kindness over the guild's law. But we cannot always reach them in time. We cannot always survive the dungeon's other dangers long enough to be found by friends instead of hunters." Her clawed hand smoothed, gently, over Ilse's small-scaled head. "We were separated from our sanctuary 3 days ago, hunted since. I did not think either of us would live to see another sunless dawn down here." "You will," Bane said, with the quiet certainty of a chieftain making a promise he intended to keep regardless of cost. "We will see you both somewhere safe. This much at least we can do." Vela's eyes, ancient and grief-worn, and cautiously, achingly hopeful, moved once more across all 6 of them. "There are others like you," she said slowly, "who come to this world through strange doors, sometimes. The gods themselves fell from somewhere beyond, long ago. That is the whole foundation of everything Orario is built upon. But I have never heard of 6 such strangers arriving together, armed, and choosing to defend a Xenos on the very first day they drew breath in this world. Something that might, on a less exhausted face, have been the beginning of a smile touched her mouth. The guild will want to know of you. The gods will want to know of you. I do not know if that is a blessing or a warning I am giving you. Maybe both," Rexar said. "Wouldn't be the first time." They made camp, such as it was, in a defensible alcove a short distance from the battle site, while Kalia finished tending Vela's wound properly, and Gazlo fussed over a small fire built from scavenged fungal husks that burned with a strange blue-green flame. Lorthamar kept watch at the chamber's mouth, bow never fully lowered. Rokan crouched near Vela, quietly, patiently coaxing more of her halting words into a fuller picture of the world they'd fallen into. A city called Orario, built above a dungeon that spawned monsters endlessly from its depths. Gods who had abandoned their true divine forms to walk among mortals, granting a blessing called Falna that let ordinary people grow stronger through trial. Familias, the households bound to each god, that formed the entire structure of the city's power and economy and violence alike. So this whole city, Rokan said slowly, working it through, built on gods handing out power like coin, and killing anything down here dat don't got dat blessing on 'em, even when dat thing's smarter than half-day people carrying the blessing. Yes, Vela said simply. And you and yours, you Xenos, you got no god, no blessing, just whatever you are, on your own. Yes, Vela said again, and something in the flatness of that single word carried the whole weight of what that meant. In a city like the one she was describing. Rexar, listening from where he sat sharpening his axe by the strange blue firelight, felt something settle in his chest that he recognized from a very long time ago, the particular clarity of purpose that had first sent him, decades younger and far less certain of himself, out into Azeroth's wilds to prove that the line between monster and person was drawn far more carelessly than anyone in power wanted to admit. He'd spent his whole life on the wrong side of that line, by half the world's reckoning, the son of an orc and an ogre, too strange for either people to fully claim, until he'd built a life and a purpose and a family of beasts and companions who judged him by what he did rather than what he was born. He looked at Vela, curled protective around her sleeping daughter in the blue-green light, and understood, with the same certainty that had guided every important choice of his strange life, exactly what they had stumbled into, and exactly which side of it he intended to stand on. Your sanctuary, he said. The hidden place your people were trying to reach. Can you lead us there, once you've rested? Vela looked up at him, surprise, and something rawer and more hopeful beneath it flickering across her exhausted face. You would come with us? Into more danger? For people who are strangers to you? Where I come from, Rexar said, we don't have a lot of use for strangers who need saving, and heroes who need convincing first. You needed help. We were there. That's the whole of it. Bane's low rumble of agreement followed a beat later, and Rokan's, and even Lorthamar, ever the pragmatist, gave a short nod from his post at the chamber's mouth that said more than words might have. Vela was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her rough, careful voice carried something that hadn't been there before. Not quite disbelief, but its gentler cousin, the fragile beginning of trust extended to strangers who had, against every hard lesson her whole hunted existence had taught her, chosen kindness first. Then I will lead you, she said, to the ones we call the deep. And I think, she paused, glancing at her sleeping daughter, at the 6 strange and impossible faces gathered around her in the flickering blue dark. I think Orario has never had to reckon with anything quite like you arriving in its dungeon. I do not know what the gods above will make of you. They'll make something of us eventually, Rexar said, rising, hefting his axe back onto his shoulder as Misha stirred and stretched at his side. Whole world's going to have to. Questions just whether they do it with open hands or drawn blades. Somewhere far above them, unseen and entirely unaware, the vast machinery of Orario, its guild, its gods, its familias, its rigid century-old certainty about exactly where the line between person and monster belonged, continued turning as it always had, blind for one more night to the fact that 6 strangers from beyond the stars had just drawn a line of their own, 37 floors down in the dark, and chosen without hesitation which side of it they meant to defend. They traveled for the better part of a day, by whatever measure of time held meaning, in a place with no sun, Vela's careful, halting directions leading them lower, past a floor where the crystal veins gave way to strange bioluminescent fungus that pulsed slow amber light, past a wide underground lake where something enormous moved beneath still black water and never surfaced, past the bones of things Rexxar didn't recognize and didn't especially want to. Ilsa walked on her own now, small clawed hand gripping her mother's tail coil for balance, casting wide, curious glances up at Misha whenever the bear padded close enough, and Misha, who had never in 20 years shown the slightest patience for strange young creatures underfoot, seemed to take a peculiar, gentle care not to startle her. Rexxar noticed it and said nothing, only felt something in his chest ease a fraction at the sight. "You are quiet," Bane said, falling into step beside him as the party wound down a narrow switchback carved into the cavern wall. "More than usual." "Thinking," Rexxar said. "About the sanctuary. About all of it." Rexxar's eyes stayed forward, tracking Vela's slow progress ahead of them. "We didn't ask to fall into this, but we're here now, and I don't much like what I'm hearing about how this city treats anything that doesn't fit its ledgers." He glanced sideways at Bane. "You feel it too. In the stone." Bane was quiet for a long moment. "I feel old grief here," he said finally. "Grief worn so deep into the bones of this place, it has become part of the land itself. Whatever this dungeon truly is, however it came to be, I do not think it began as simply a hole full of monsters for adventurers to kill for coin and glory. I think something older is buried at the root of it, and I think whatever that something is, it has been watching us since we arrived. Watching us how? I cannot say precisely, only that I do not think we are quite as alone down here as we appear." Bane's staff tapped once against the stone, thoughtful. "Whatever this place is, Rexxar, I do not believe it is only a dungeon. I believe it may, in some fashion none of us yet understand, be alive." The thought settled uneasy in Rexxar's chest, and he found himself thinking of the ribbed, breathing stone of the chamber where they'd first arrived, and did not have a comfortable answer to offer. They reached the sanctuary as what passed for evening in the endless dark, Vela's sense of it at least, marked by some rhythm in the fungal light's slow pulse that the rest of them couldn't yet read. It was not what Rexxar expected. He had pictured, without quite meaning to, something crude, a cave, a burrow, the kind of makeshift shelter-hunted things built when they had no better option. What he found instead, tucked into a vast natural cavern whose ceiling glittered with slow-drifting motes of blue light like an inverted night sky, was something closer to a village. Structures woven from mineral fiber and something like coral, warm firelight, real fire, this time, amber and gold, glowing from carved windows. Figures moving between them, some serpent-bodied like Vela, others insectoid, others massive and armored, others small and quick and bird-like, dozens of shapes that Orario's guild would have logged without hesitation as monsters, moving through the ordinary rhythms of daily life, carrying water, tending small gardens of pale luminous fungus, minding children. The sight hit Rexxar harder than he expected. It looked, more than anything, like home. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. A ripple of alarm passed through the settlement. The instant armed strangers appeared at the cavern's edge, shapes converging, weapons of bone and stone, and strange craftsmanship raised. A low collective growl building from a dozen throats at once. "Wait!" Vela's rough voice cut through it, urgent, raised as high as her still-healing throat would allow. "Wait! They are not hunters. They saved Ilsa and me. They fought the broodmother's swarm for us." The tension didn't vanish, but it hesitated, weapons wavering, and from among the gathered shapes, one figure stepped forward that made even Rexxar, who had faced down dragons and old gods on his own world, feel the particular respectful caution of encountering something genuinely formidable. He stood easily 8 feet at the shoulder, bull-headed, powerfully muscled beneath simple cloth wraps worn. Rexxar understood at a glance, out of some deliberate choice rather than necessity, a massive greatsword held loose and ready in one hand. His eyes, when they fixed on Rexxar's party, were unmistakably intelligent, weighing, careful, and not unkind, even through their wariness. "You are not adventurers," the Minotaur said, in a voice like grinding stone, echoing Vela's own halting, careful speech, but far more practiced. "Your weapons, your bearing, I have not seen your like before, in all my years in this dungeon. Who are you, and why have you brought yourselves to our door?" "My name is Rexxar," Rexxar said, planting the head of his axe against the stone and spreading his empty free hand, the same gesture of open peace he'd offered Vela hours before. "This is Bane, Rokon, Lorthamar, Kalia, Gazlo. We came through a door none of us opened, into a chamber above, where we found Vela and her daughter being hunted by a broodmother's swarm. We fought. We won. We offered to see them safely home. That's the whole of why we're here." The Minotaur studied him for a long, weighing moment, gaze flicking to Vela's confirming nod, to Ilsa's small hand still curled trusting into her mother's coil, to Misha sitting calm and unthreatening at Rexxar's heel. "I am Asterius," he said finally, something in his broad shoulders easing by a fraction. "I speak for the deep, in matters such as this. You have my thanks, and the thanks of all who dwell here, for what you did for Vela and Ilsa." He paused. "But you understand. Strangers who fall from nowhere into a dungeon and immediately choose to defend Xenos, when the whole of the world above has spent 100 years teaching every adventurer who descends here that we are vermin to be culled. Such a thing does not happen without reason. What are you, truly, and what do you want now that you have found us?" It was Bane who answered, stepping forward with the particular unhurried gravity that made even strangers instinctively lean in to listen. "We are not from this world," the tauren chieftain said. "We come from a place called Azeroth, where my people, and Rexxar's, and Rokon's, and Kalia's, were each, in our own time, hunted and named monster by others who never troubled themselves to look closer. We built something different, in the end. Not a piece without cost. Azeroth's history is soaked in more blood than I would wish on any world, but a understanding, hard one, that the line between person and beast is drawn far more carelessly by those in power than truth ever justifies." His dark eyes held Asterius's steadily. "We do not know your world. We do not know your guild, your gods, your city above. But we know what it is to be looked at with a blade already half drawn, simply for the shape one was born into. We will not stand by and watch that happen here, now that we have seen it with our own eyes. That is what we want, if you would call it wanting anything at all. Simply, to not look away." A long silence followed, broken only by the distant murmur of the settlement, the soft crackle of firelight, Ilsa's small, restless shifting against her mother's side. Then, from somewhere behind Asterius, another voice spoke, quieter, stranger, carrying an unsettling resonance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the cavern at once. "How very interesting." The gathered Xenos parted, and a robed, hooded figure emerged, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace that set every instinct in Rexxar's body faintly on edge. Not fear exactly, but the deep animal recognition of something that did not fit neatly into any category his mind knew how to sort. Skeletal hints of armor showed beneath the robe's folds. The face beneath the hood was hidden entirely, and yet Rexxar had the distinct, uncomfortable sense of being closely, thoroughly studied. 6 strangers, the figure said, torn from a world beyond the stars, who choose without hesitation to defend the least and most despised of Orario's peoples on the very first day of their arrival, and who speak of understandings hard-won on their own world through blood and time. Oranos will want to hear of this personally. I have not felt anything so genuinely unprecedented enter this dungeon in longer than I care to reckon. "And you are?" Lorthamar asked, bow not quite lowered, wariness sharp in his voice. "Fells," the figure said, inclining its hooded head in something like a bow. "I speak for a god who has kept the truth of the Xenos hidden for longer than any of you would easily believe, and for a great deal else besides, in this city's deeper and less comfortable secrets." A pause, and something almost like amusement colored the strange resonant voice. "You have wandered, quite by accident, directly into the oldest and most carefully guarded fracture in Orario's foundations. I wonder if you understand yet just how much you are about to unsettle." "We're getting a fair sense of it," Rexar said dryly. "Good," Fells said, "because I do not think, once word of you begins to spread, and it will spread, faster than any of you can yet imagine, in a city built on gossip, rumor, and the desperate hunger of every god and familia to understand any new source of power the instant it appears, that any of you will have the luxury of remaining unnoticed for very long." They were given quarters in the deep that night, modest, woven chambers warm with the same amber firelight, and for the first time since the rift had torn them from one world into another, the party allowed themselves something like rest. Rexar sat near the cavern's edge long after the others had settled, Misha curled heavy and warm against his side, watching the slow drift of blue motes across the impossible ceiling and turning over everything Fells had told them in the hours since. A hidden god beneath a hidden god, a city built on a lie about what counted as a person, a dungeon that might, in some fashion none of them yet understood, be alive and watching, and 6 strangers from beyond the stars who had, within a single day of arriving, already made themselves the sworn allies of the very people that city's entire economy and self-image depended on hunting. Bane settled beside him without a word, staff planted, gaze following Rexar's up toward the drifting lights. "You are thinking of home," the tauren chieftain said. It wasn't a question. "Thinking that we didn't get a choice about coming here," Rexar said. "But we've got every choice in the world about what we do now that we have. And I keep coming back to the same answer, no matter how many times I turn it over. As do I." Bane's low voice carried the particular weight of a leader who had made harder choices than this one, many times, and never once regretted choosing the side of the smaller and more hunted. "We cannot undo 100 years of this city's history in a single night, Rexar. Whatever we choose here will not end cleanly. It will cost something. It always does, when the powerful are asked to reconsider who they have been comfortable killing." He paused. "But I did not survive everything Azeroth demanded of my people, and of me, to arrive in a new world and choose silence in the face of the same old cruelty, simply because it wears an unfamiliar god's face this time. No," Rexar agreed quietly, "neither did I." Above them, unseen, unfelt, something vast and old and patient stirred faintly in the depths of the dungeon's ancient stone, as if the whole breathing, listening world beneath Orario had, for the first time in longer than even Fells could easily reckon, found something new worth watching closely. And far above that, 37 floors up in a city gleaming with Babel Tower's white spire, and humming with the ordinary business of gods and adventurers, who had no notion yet that their entire understanding of the world was about to be tested. A message was already beginning its slow climb upward through whispered rumor and cautious report, the first fragile thread of a story that would, before very much longer, reach ears powerful enough to shake all of Orario to its foundations. The message that would eventually unmake a century of certainty in Orario began, as such things often do, with something far smaller and far more mundane. A routine patrol of guild-licensed adventurers descending to catalog monster density on the 35th floor, 3 days behind schedule, and grumbling about it, who instead found a broodmother's headless corpse. Findimna would later say, though not for some time yet, not until the story had grown large enough to reach even Loki Familia's captain's careful attention, that it was the wound itself that told him something was wrong before anything else did. A broodmother of that size and age did not die easily, and it certainly did not die to a single clean stroke. Something had removed her head from her thorax in one motion, with enough force behind the blow to send the body skidding 3 full meters across stone. No known adventurer weapon left a wound quite like that. No known skill either, not one on record with the guild. But that report was still 3 days from filing, still working its slow way up through junior clerks and mid-tier officials before it would ever reach a desk with the authority to act on it. For now, in the endless dark 37 floors below, Rexar's party knew nothing of it at all. They descended further the next morning, or the next cycle of amber light at least, since morning meant little this deep, following fells through passages the hooded figure clearly knew intimately, deeper into a part of the dungeon that felt, even to Rexar's well-traveled instincts, distinctly different from anything above it. The stone here was smoother, more deliberate, carved rather than merely grown, and threaded through with strange mechanisms, gears and channels of some pale alloy, humming faintly with a magic none of them recognized. Knossos, Fell said, noting the party's careful attention to the surrounding architecture. Or what remains navigable of it, at least. A city built beneath the city, by hands with ambitions that outstripped their wisdom by a considerable margin. Oranos has claimed what he can of it, in the long years since, for purposes rather more careful than its original builder intended. And your god, Bane said, this Oranos. What does he want with us? Understanding first, Fells said. He has kept the Xenos hidden and protected for longer than any of you would easily credit, at considerable cost, through considerable secrecy, because the alternative, the truth surfacing all at once, without careful handling, would very likely mean their extermination. He is, above all else, a patient god. I suspect he will want to know whether you 6 represent an opportunity for that patience to finally bear fruit, or an accelerant that burns down everything he has built before it is ready. And which do you think we are? Roken asked. Dark eyes narrowed. Fells's hooded head tilted, and something in the strange resonant voice carried, for the first time, a note that might almost have been genuine curiosity. I have not yet decided, which, I will say, is itself unusual. I have found very little in this world in a great many years that I could not immediately place. They walked on in a silence that felt, to Rexar, less uncomfortable than thoughtful, the whole party turning over the weight of what they were walking into. Oranos received them in a chamber at the heart of Knossos' ruins, vast and ancient, and lit by the same slow pulse of blue crystal light that had marked their arrival, seated on a throne carved from stone, so old it had begun, in places, to crumble back into dust. He was smaller than Rexar expected, an old man's frame, weathered and weary, robed in plain gray. But the moment his eyes lifted to meet the party's, Rexar felt the unmistakable weight of something ancient and formidable behind that unassuming exterior. This was, whatever else he was, unmistakably a god. 6 strangers, Oranos said, voice low and measured, carrying centuries of patience worn into every syllable, torn from a world I have never heard named, who chose within hours of their arrival to defend the very people I have spent the better part of my long exile trying to protect. His gaze moved across each of them in turn, lingering, Rexar noted, longest on Bane, whose quiet gravity seemed to draw the gods' careful attention. Fells tells me you spoke, in the deep, of hard-won understanding from your own world's history. I would hear that history, if you are willing to share it. I have found, across a very long life, that a great deal can be learned about strangers by the wounds they carry from wherever they came from. Rexxar glanced at Bane, who inclined his head slightly. Go ahead. And so it was Rexxar who spoke first, laying out the long, brutal, unfinished story of the Horde as plainly as he knew how. Orcs corrupted and enslaved by demonic influence long before any of the living among them had been born, then freed, then forced to rebuild an identity and a home from nothing, on a world that had every reason to hate them for what they'd once been made into. Tauren driven from their ancestral plains by the same human kingdoms that called his people savages. Trolls fractured by centuries of war and prejudice both from without and within. The Forsaken, risen from death itself into a kind of existence the living world instinctively recoiled from, fighting for decades simply to be recognized as something other than abomination. Blood elves, half-mad with magical addiction after their home was shattered, choosing paths both dark and redemptive in the long search for a way forward. We built something, Rexxar said, when the long telling finally wound down. That isn't perfect. Azeroth still soaked in more blood and old grudges than I'd wish on anyone, and the Horde's made its own share of terrible choices along the way. Choices I won't pretend away just to make this story sound cleaner than it was. But we learned, over and over, the hard way, that the line between person and monster gets drawn by whoever holds the most power at the time, and that line is almost never drawn honestly. We learned to stop trusting it. We learned to look closer, every time, no matter how many times it cost us to do it. Oranos was quiet for a long moment after Rexxar finished, his ancient eyes distant, weighing something far larger than the 6 strangers standing before him. I have lived in this world since before Orario existed, the god said finally. I have watched 100 years of Falna and Familia and the guild's careful ledgers convince an entire civilization that the question of who deserves to live is a simple one. Blessed or unblessed, adventurer or monster, nothing more complicated than that. I have hidden the Xenos not because I believed that lie, but because I understood, with a certainty that has cost me more than I can easily say, that the truth surfacing too soon, too carelessly, would mean their destruction rather than their acceptance. Orario is not ready. It has never been ready. His gaze sharpened, fixed on Rexxar with sudden intensity. And now 6 strangers with no god, no Falna, no stake whatsoever in this city's century of careful lies, have arrived and simply chosen, without hesitation, without needing to be convinced. A pause. I confess, I do not yet know whether that is the answer to a hope I abandoned believing in long ago, or the spark that finally burns down everything I have spent so long carefully protecting. Maybe it doesn't have to be only one or the other, Bane said quietly. Fire burns down what's rotten so something better can grow in its place. We are not asking you to trust us blindly, Oranos. We are telling you plainly what we believe, and what we intend to do regardless of whether it is convenient for your long patience. The Xenos deserve better than hiding. We do not know your city well enough yet to say how that better comes to pass. But we do not intend to stand quietly by while it does not. Something in Oranos' weathered face shifted. Old grief, old hope, both tangled together in a way that spoke of centuries of exactly this same impossible weighing. Then let us speak plainly of what comes next, the god said, because I do not think either of us has the luxury of pretending this can stay contained much longer. A broodmother of considerable age was found dead on the 35th floor, 2 days past, slain by a blow no guild record can account for. It will be reported. It will be investigated. And when that investigation eventually traces its way down to whatever the 6 of you did in that chamber, and it will, Orario's adventurers are considerably more capable than this city's arrogance sometimes allows them credit for. The world above will begin asking questions that none of us will be able to fully control the answering of. The council that followed stretched long into the amber-lit evening, Fells laying out in careful and exhaustive detail the delicate architecture of alliances and rivalries that governed Orario's surface. The guild's rigid bureaucratic caution, Loki Familia's raw martial dominance, Freya Familia's terrifying, near untouchable strength coupled with a goddess whose interests were notoriously, dangerously her own. Ganesha Familia's public role policing the city's monster-related incidents, Hephaestus Familia's forges, and the quiet influence that came with arming half the city's strongest adventurers, and beneath and around all of it, Evilus, patient and hidden, watching for exactly the kind of instability 6 strangers from beyond the stars might represent. There is also, Fells added, near the council's end, something almost careful entering the strange resonant voice, a particular familia I would draw your attention to above the rest, for reasons that may prove relevant sooner than any of us expect. Hestia Familia, small, until recently barely notable at all, save for a single adventurer within it who has, in a remarkably short span of time, become the subject of a great deal of the city's attention. A young man named Bell Cranel, who possesses an unusual and still poorly understood degree of natural talent, and who has already on more than one occasion shown a willingness to treat certain of the Xenos with more compassion than this city's laws would generally permit. You think he'd be sympathetic to us, Rokan said. I think, Fells said, that he already is sympathetic to the Xenos, in ways that have caused Oranos and myself no small amount of careful management to keep quiet. Whether he proves sympathetic to 6 strangers who fight with no Falna at all, wielding power this world has never catalogued, that I could not yet say with confidence. But if this story is going to surface regardless of how carefully we try to contain it, I would rather it surface first through someone already inclined toward mercy than through the guild's more rigid officials, or worse, through Evilus's considerably less merciful interest. Rexar looked around the gathered council, Uranos's ancient, weighing patience, Fells's careful, unreadable calculation, Bane's quiet resolve, Vela and Asterius, watching with the particular hope of people who had spent their entire existence hidden and hunted, daring for the first time in longer than any of them could easily say to imagine something different, and felt the full weight of what they had stumbled into finally, fully settle across his shoulders. Then we don't wait for the story to find its own way up, he said. We go to this Bell Cranel ourselves. Better we choose the ground we make first contact on, than let rumor and fear choose it for us. Uranos studied him for a long moment, and something that might, on a god who had spent so very long buried under the weight of careful patience, have been the faint, fragile beginning of hope, crossed his weathered features. Then let us begin, the ancient god said. The very thing I have spent 100 years believing this city was not yet ready for. Far above, in the ordinary golden light of a late afternoon, Orario had no idea was about to change forever. A white-haired young adventurer named Bell Cranel sat on the steps of Twilight Manor, absently sharpening a blade he'd already sharpened twice that day, and felt, for reasons he could not have named, and would not understand until several days later, a strange and persistent restlessness he couldn't quite shake, as though something vast and unprecedented had just begun moving toward him from somewhere far below the city's familiar streets. Bell Cranel had learned, over the past several months of a life that had transformed from painfully ordinary into something closer to legend at a pace that still occasionally left him breathless, that his instincts about the dungeon were rarely wrong. It was a strange, half-formed sense, not quite skill and not quite ordinary awareness, that had saved his life more than once on the lower floors, a prickling awareness of something significant shifting just beyond the edge of what he could see or hear. He felt it now, sitting on Twilight Manor's worn stone steps in the late gold light, blade forgotten in his lap, and could not for the life of him say why. "You've got that look again," Welf Krotso said, dropping onto the step beside him, with the particular heavy grace of a man who'd spent the day at the forge and intended to spend the evening doing considerably less. His red hair was still damp with sweat, soot smudged along one forearm. "The one where you're staring at nothing like it personally offended you." "I don't know how to explain it," Bell admitted. "It's just a feeling, like something's coming." "Something's always coming," Lily said, not looking up from where she sat cross-legged nearby, meticulously counting the day's earnings into careful stacks with the particular focus of a prum who had spent too many years of her life without enough coin to ever again take counting it for granted. "That's the dungeon for you. Something is always coming. Usually it's just trying to eat you." This felt different, Bell said, though he couldn't have said precisely how, only that the restless prickle at the back of his neck refused to settle, no matter how many times he tried to shrug it off as nothing. He would think back on that feeling, later, with a kind of wry disbelief at how understated his own instincts had turned out to be. The summons came 2 days later, delivered not by guild courier as Bell might have expected, but by a quiet, unremarkable-looking figure who intercepted him alone on the walk back from the dungeon's entrance at Babel Tower, moving with an unsettling fluid grace that immediately set every instinct Bell had honed across months of near-death experience firmly on edge. "Bell Cranel," the figure said, voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oranos requests your presence. There are matters concerning the Xenos that require someone of your particular disposition." Bell's breath caught. He had kept the truth of his friendship with the Xenos, with Asterius, with Weena, with the small hidden community he'd helped protect on more than one occasion, as carefully guarded as he knew how, terrified always of what would happen if the wrong ears learned of it. "Is something wrong?" he asked, voice low, urgent. "Are they in danger?" "Not in the way you might fear," Fels said. "But something has happened that Oranos believes concerns you directly, and I do not think it is a conversation best had in the open street." A pause, and something almost careful entered the strange voice. 6 strangers have arrived in the dungeon's depths. They fought to defend a Xenos mother and her child within hours of their arrival, asking nothing in return. Oranos wishes you to meet them before the rest of Orario learns of their existence and decides, on its own terms, what to make of them. Bell's mind raced through a dozen questions at once, but the one that surfaced first, unbidden, was the simplest. They helped Vela, without knowing anything about her, without any reason to, without hesitation, from what I am told, Fels said, which is, I confess, rather more remarkable than it perhaps sounds to you in the telling. The passage down through Knossos' quiet ruins felt, to Bell, like walking into a part of the world he'd only ever half believed existed, even after everything he'd already seen. Fels leading him through corridors humming with strange old magic, deeper than he'd ever personally descended, until they emerged at last into the vast chamber, where Oranos kept his long, patient vigil. Bell had met the ancient god twice before, and both times the sheer weight of centuries behind those weathered eyes had left him faintly unsteady. This time, that weight was joined by something else entirely. 5 figures and one enormous bear gathered near the chamber's edge, each of them unlike anything Bell had ever seen in his life, and every one of them turning to study him with open, careful curiosity the instant he entered. "Bell Cranel," Oranos said, and something in the god's voice carried, Bell thought, a note of genuine warmth he hadn't heard there before. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I would like you to meet 6 travelers whose arrival, I believe is about to change a great deal about how this city understands itself." Bell's eyes moved across them. The massive green-skinned warrior with the chipped tusk and the scarred axe. The towering bull-headed figure whose quiet, gathered stillness reminded him, strangely, of Asterius. The lean blue-skinned figure with tribal tattoos and twin blades. The pale, composed woman whose skin carried a faint, unsettling translucence. The sharp-featured, red-gold-haired figure with a longbow slung ready at his shoulder, and the small green figure grinning at him from behind an assortment of tools Bell couldn't begin to identify. "I'm Bell," he managed, belatedly remembering his own name in the face of so much to take in at once. "Bell Cranel. It's good to meet you." The massive green-skinned warrior stepped forward first, offering a hand nearly the size of Bell's whole forearm, and when he spoke, his voice carried an easy, unhurried warmth that put Bell somehow, immediately, at ease despite everything else about the moment that should have left him rattled. "Rexar," he said, "this is Bane, Rokan, Kalia, Lorthamar, Gazlo, and this." A gesture down at the bear, who regarded Bell with what could only be described as friendly curiosity, "is Misha. Fells tells us you're a friend to the Xenos. That true?" "Yes," Bell said, without hesitation, and felt something in his chest ease at how simple it was to say it here, in this strange gathered company, in a way he'd never once been able to say it plainly, in the ordinary daylight world above. "Weena, one of the Xenos. She saved my life. I promised her I'd protect her people however I could. I've tried to keep that promise ever since." Something shifted across Rexar's weathered, tusked face. Approval, unmistakable, and something warmer beneath it. "Then we're already on the same side of this," he said. "Good. Makes the rest of this conversation a lot easier." They talked for hours, Bell recounting, haltingly at first and then with growing openness, as the strangeness of the gathered company settled into something closer to comfort. The story of Ween, of the hidden Xenos community he'd helped protect, of the constant careful balance of secrecy and risk that had defined every choice he'd made since first discovering the truth Orario's guild worked so hard to keep buried. Rexar and his companions in turn laying out the fuller shape of what had happened since the rift first tore them from their own world. Vela and Ilsa, the broodmother's swarm, the Deep's hidden sanctuary, Oranos's long patient exile of secrecy on the Xenos' behalf. "You're not from the dungeon," Bell said slowly, working through the full weight of it. "You're not from Orario at all. You came from somewhere else entirely. And the very first thing you did here was choose to protect people. This whole city's been taught to kill on sight." "Didn't take much choosing, honestly," Rokan said, with a faint, sharp grin. "We been on the wrong side of that exact judgment more times than any of us care to count. Back home. Recognize it pretty quick when we see it again." "I think," Bane said, quiet and grave, "that is precisely why Oranos wished you to meet us before the rest of your city does, Bell Cranel. Because we intend, whatever the cost, to make plain what we saw and what we chose. And I suspect that will not sit easily with a great many powerful people in Orario, once it becomes known." Bell looked between them, at Oranos' ancient, weighing patience, at Fells's careful watchfulness, at 6 strangers from beyond the stars who had chosen, without needing to be convinced, exactly the fight Bell himself had been quietly, desperately fighting alone for months, and felt something in him settle into a resolve he hadn't quite realized. Until this exact moment, he'd been waiting his whole short adventuring life to find allies for. "Then you're not going to be doing it alone," Bell said. "Whatever happens next, I'm with you. Ween, Asterius, all of them. They deserve better than hiding forever. If you're really willing to stand up and say that out loud, in front of the whole city if it comes to it, then so am I." Oranos' weathered face, watching the exchange, carried an expression that Fells, who had known the god across centuries of careful, grinding patience, recognized as something the ancient deity had not permitted himself in a very long time indeed. Hope, unguarded and entirely undisguised. "Then let us speak," the god said, "of precisely how 6 strangers, one determined young adventurer, and an old god's long-buried secret, intend to change what this entire city believes about the line between person and monster. And let us speak plainly, because I do not believe, once this begins, that there will be any road left leading backward." Outside Knossos' ancient walls, unseen and unfelt by any of them, the same slow, patient stirring that had marked the dungeon's reaction to the stranger's arrival days before shifted again, deeper and more deliberate this time, as though something vast, old, and long silent had, for the first time in 100 years of Orario's careful certainty, finally found something worth waking fully for. The report reached Guildmaster Royman Martyr's desk on the 4th day, buried in a stack of routine floor surveys that his junior clerks had, in their usual efficient caution, flagged for closer review the moment the Broodmother incident's details became clear. Royman was not, by nature or by the demands of his considerable office, a man given to alarm. The dungeon produced strangeness on a near-daily basis, and a guildmaster who panicked at every unusual death report would have worn himself to nothing within a month. But even Royman's practiced calm faltered somewhat as he read through the wound analysis a second time. A single stroke, no skill signature on record, a wound pattern consistent with a bladed weapon of considerable mass, wielded with strength that exceeded even most first-tier adventurers' recorded capability. "Get me Ganesha Familia's liaison," he said to the clerk waiting at his door. "And I want Oranos' office informed as a courtesy, before this goes any further up the chain than it needs to." The clerk hesitated. "Sir, Oranos' office rarely responds to routine inquiries." "This isn't routine," Royman said, setting the report down with more weight than the gesture strictly required. "Send it anyway." Ganesha's response, when it came 2 days later, arrived with rather more urgency than Royman had expected. Not merely an acknowledgement, but the elephant-headed god himself, requesting a private audience within the hour, a degree of personal attention Ganesha rarely extended to matters this far below the guild's usual threshold for divine involvement. "You understand," Ganesha said, settling into the chair across from Royman's desk with an energy that belied the gravity of what he'd come to discuss, "that my familia exists specifically to manage incidents involving unregistered or unusual monster activity before they become public panic. I do not say this to flatter my own importance. I say it because what you've sent me does not fit any category my familia has ever needed to prepare a response for." "You have a theory," Royman said. It wasn't a question. "I have several," Ganesha admitted, "and I dislike all of them in roughly equal measure. A rogue first-tier adventurer, operating outside guild registration, testing some new weapon, or skill in the depths without authorization. Possible, but the wound pattern doesn't match any documented combat style. A new and previously uncatalogued monster variant, powerful enough to kill a broodmother outright. Also possible, though it raises its own uncomfortable questions about what else might be evolving down there that we haven't detected yet. Or Ganesha's usual theatrical energy dimmed by a fraction, replaced with something more careful, something entirely outside our existing framework altogether. I have asked several of my own adventurers to make a discreet descent to the affected floor. I would very much like to know what they find before this reaches Denatus, and every god in the city starts demanding answers I don't yet have." Royman considered this for a long moment. "And if it is something outside our framework, then," Ganesha said, "I imagine we are about to have a considerably more interesting month than either of us was hoping for." 3 floors below where that conversation took place, entirely unaware of the careful machinery of guild investigation now turning in their direction. Bell led Rexar's party, minus Bane and Kalia, who remained behind with Oranos to continue the slower, more delicate work of planning how the truth might best be introduced to the wider city. Up through the dungeon's higher levels toward the hidden Xenos sanctuary he'd protected for months. "You said her name is Wine," Rexar said, as they climbed, Misha padding easy and quiet at his side, despite her considerable bulk. "She's a Lamia," Bell said. "Like Vela, actually. I think they might even know each other from before. She's the reason I started all of this, really. She saved my life when she didn't have to, and I couldn't just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen what she really was underneath what everyone told me a monster was supposed to be." "Sounds familiar," Rokan said, with a faint, knowing grin. They reached the sanctuary, smaller than the deep, hidden behind a carefully concealed passage Bell navigated with the ease of long practice, and the reaction to the party's arrival mirrored, almost precisely, the wary tension that had greeted them in the deep days before. Weapons raised, low warning growls, a tight defensive knot forming around the community's more vulnerable members. "It's all right," Bell called quickly, hands raised. "They're friends. They saved Vela and Ilsa. They're not hunters, I promise." A figure pushed forward through the gathered Xenos at the mention of Vela's name. Serpentine, pale-scaled, her expression shifting rapidly from wary alarm to disbelieving hope. "Vela? You have seen her? She is alive?" "She's safe," Rexar confirmed. "In the deep, with her daughter. We brought her there ourselves, a few days back." The Lamia's whole posture sagged with visible relief, and Bell stepped forward to make quiet, careful introductions, watching with quiet satisfaction as the initial wariness among the gathered Xenos slowly, cautiously began to ease. "This is Weena," Bell said. She's one of the reasons I started protecting the Xenos in the first place." Weena studied Rexar's party for a long moment, her expression carrying the particular weighing caution of someone who had survived, precisely because she never extended trust carelessly. "You fought for Vela," she said finally, without knowing her. "Without any reason to, beyond simply seeing that she needed help." "That's about the whole of it, yeah," Rexar said. "Then I think," Ween said slowly, something in her careful expression beginning, at last, to soften, "that Orario is about to learn something it has spent a very long time refusing to see." That evening, gathered in the sanctuary's central chamber around a fire that burned warm gold against carved stone walls, Rexar found himself in quiet conversation with Asterius, who had traveled up from the deep separately to help coordinate between the two hidden communities, now that word of the stranger's presence had begun, carefully, to spread among the Xenos. "You fight like someone who has done this a very long time," Asterius said, settling his considerable bulk onto a low stone bench near the fire. "Not merely skilled, familiar with the particular weight of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Spent most of my life at it, one way or another," Rexar said. "Grew up not fitting anywhere clean, myself. Half orc, half ogre, too much of one thing for some people, too much of the other for the rest. Learned early that the folks quickest to call something a monster were usually the ones who hadn't bothered looking past the shape of it." Asterius was quiet for a moment, firelight flickering across his broad, bull-horned features. "I was born in this dungeon," he said finally. "I do not know any other life than the one I have lived here. First hunted, then hidden, and only recently, through Bell Cranel's courage and Oranos's long patience, permitted to imagine something like a future beyond mere survival. I confess, I did not think I would live to see 6 strangers from beyond the stars arrive and simply choose, without needing to be argued into it, exactly the cause I had begun to fear might never be championed by anyone with the power to truly change things." "We're not saviors," Rexar said, careful, honest. I want to be plain about that, because I've seen what happens when people start believing that of themselves, and it never ends well for anyone involved. We're 6 people from another world who saw something wrong and couldn't walk past it. That's all. Whatever changes here, it's going to take more than us. It's going to take people like you, and Bell, and Oranos, willing to keep pushing long after we're not the newest, strangest thing in the room anymore. Asterius considered this, and something like respect deepened in his intelligent dark eyes. That, he said slowly, is, I think, precisely the kind of honesty this city has needed to hear for a very long time, and precisely the kind it has almost never received from anyone claiming to champion our cause. Perhaps that is why Oranos placed such immediate faith in you. Far above, in a modest office within the guild's central tower, Ganesha's dispatched adventurers returned from their discreet survey of the 35th floor, with a report that would, within another day, finally push the whole quiet, careful machinery of investigation into motion that neither Rexar's party nor Oranos's careful planning had yet fully anticipated. Fresh tracks, 6 distinct sets, moving with purpose and coordination through territory no ordinary adventuring party had any registered business exploring, alongside confirmed sightings, brief, cautious, second-hand, of armed strangers unlike anything catalogued in any familia's records, traveling in the company of Xenos. Ganesha read the report twice, in his private chambers, long after his usual theatrical energy had given way to something far more careful. Well, he murmured to himself, setting the report down at last. It seems Orario's quiet century is about to become considerably less quiet. He rose, already composing in his mind the message he would need to send, not to Royman this time, but higher, to the one authority in the city whose attention this particular discovery could not, in good conscience, remain withheld from any longer. Denatus would need to be called. And once it was, there would be no controlling any longer exactly how the whole of Orario's assembled gods chose to receive the news that something entirely unprecedented had arrived beneath their city, and had already, without asking anyone's permission, chosen precisely which side of Orario's oldest and most carefully guarded lie it intended to stand on. Denatus convened on the 7th day, in the vast amphitheater carved into Babel Tower's foundations where Orario's gods gathered when matters arose too significant for any single familia to manage alone. It had not been called in nearly 2 years, not since the Apollo Familia's disastrous ultimatum against Hestia had last forced the city's divine population into open, collective session. And the scale of that absence showed in the crowded, restless energy filling the chamber as god after god arrived, drawn by rumor that had, despite every careful precaution Oranos and Ganesha had attempted, already begun spreading through Orario's gossip-hungry streets faster than any official channel could contain. Loki arrived flanked by Finn and a handful of her familia's senior officers, sharp eyes already cataloging the room with the particular predatory alertness of someone who had learned long ago that Denatus sessions called on short notice rarely brought good news. Hephaestus took her seat near the chamber's edge, quiet and watchful, one hand absently tracing the burn-scarred skin along her jaw. Miach arrived nearly last, small and unassuming as always, though his eyes carried none of their usual gentle distraction. And near the amphitheater's highest tier, arriving with the effortless, gravity-bending presence that always accompanied her regardless of how quietly she moved, Freya took her seat, expression composed into the particular unreadable calm that had, across 100 years, made her simultaneously the most beautiful and the most quietly feared deity in the city. Ganesha stood at the chamber's center when the assembly finally settled, and there was none of his usual theatrical flourish in the way he began. 6 days ago, he said, voice carrying clean and clear across the hushed amphitheater, a broodmother of considerable age was found dead on the 35th floor, killed by a single blow no registered skill or weapon in this city's records can account for. Since then, my familia has confirmed multiple independent sightings of armed strangers, 6 in total by the most reliable count, traveling through the dungeon's depths in the company of what can only be described as Xenos. The word landed across the chamber like a struck bell. Ganesha did not pause to let the murmur settle before continuing. I am aware, he said, that the existence of the Xenos, and the degree to which certain parties in this city have known of and protected them, is a matter some among us would prefer remain unspoken. I will not pretend otherwise. But 6 strangers of unprecedented power have now arrived in our city, have demonstrated combat capability exceeding first-tier benchmarks, and have chosen, apparently without hesitation, to align themselves with a population this city's laws currently classify as vermin to be culled. I do not believe, given the scale of what has already begun spreading through the streets, that silence remains a viable option for much longer. Loki was the first to speak into the stunned quiet that followed, her usual lazy drawl sharpened with genuine interest. Unprecedented power, huh? No Falna signature at all? None detected, Ganesha confirmed, which raises its own considerable questions. They ain't ours then, Loki said, something calculating entering her expression despite the casual tone. Not blessed by any god in this room. That's actually kinda interesting, ain't it? It is more than interesting, said a voice from the amphitheater's upper tier, cool and precise, cutting through the murmur with the effortless authority that came naturally to a goddess who had never in her long existence needed to raise her voice to be heard. Every eye in the chamber turned toward Freya. It is a category this city has never had to reckon with. Power that answers to no god's blessing, wielded by beings capable of felling a broodmother in a single stroke. I confess, I find myself considerably curious to see it firsthand. Something in the particular quality of Freya's curiosity sent an unmistakable ripple of unease through the gathered gods, the whole chamber intimately, uncomfortably aware of exactly what tended to happen to things Freya found herself curious about. With respect, Ganesha said, carefully, I would caution against any familia approaching these strangers with anything less than full diplomatic care. We do not yet understand their capabilities, their intentions, or their relationship to whatever brought them here. A hasty approach risks. A hasty approach, Freya said, something almost amused touching her composed features, was never my intention, Ganesha. I have found across a great many years that the things worth having are rarely won through haste. She let the words settle and did not clarify further, and the ambiguity of exactly what she meant by having sent a fresh wave of unease through more than one god present. It was Hephaestus, quiet until now, who spoke next, voice carrying the particular blunt practicality that had made her familia's forges the backbone of half the city's arsenal. Before we start speculating about whose familia gets first claim on 6 mysterious strangers, maybe someone should ask the more obvious question. What do they want? Because from what Ganesha's just described, it sounds like they've already made their intentions pretty clear. They're protecting Xenos. That's not a mystery. That's a stated position. The question this council actually needs to answer is what Orario intends to do about 100 years of law that position directly challenges. The chamber went very quiet at that, the uncomfortable weight of Hephaestus's blunt framing settling over gods who had, until this exact moment, mostly managed to avoid confronting the question quite so directly. That, said a new voice, calm and ancient, is precisely the question I called this session to raise. Every head turned. Uranos rarely attended Denatus in person. His long self-imposed exile from the city's more public affairs was itself a matter of considerable, careful rumor. And his appearance now, walking slowly to the amphitheater's center with Fels's hooded shadow a step behind him, sent a fresh ripple of startled murmur through the assembled gods. I have known of the Xenos' existence for a very long time, Orario said, and there was no apology in the admission. Only the weary, weighted honesty of a god, finally setting down a burden he had carried alone for far too long. I have protected certain of them, in secret, because I believed, and still believe, that this city was not yet ready to reckon honestly with the question of what truly separates a person from a monster. 6 strangers have now arrived who owe this city nothing, who ask nothing of any god in this room, and who have chosen, without needing convincing, exactly the position I have spent 100 years too afraid to argue for openly. His ancient eyes swept the chamber, weary but unflinching. I am done hiding it. Whatever comes of this council's deliberation, I intend to bring these 6 strangers before you all, openly, so that Orario may finally decide, honestly, and in the light, what kind of city it actually wishes to be. The silence that followed was total. The debate that consumed the remainder of Denatus' session stretched long into the night, and Orario related the fuller shape of it to Rexar's party the following day, with the particular weary patience of a god who had spent 100 years managing precisely this kind of fractious, unpredictable divine argument. Ganesha has proposed a formal introduction, a controlled meeting, under his familia's oversight, allowing the wider council to assess you directly before any decisions are made regarding your status, or the Xenos'. Oranios's weathered face carried a complicated weight. Loki is curious, and cautiously favorable, though her curiosity is rarely without its own calculations. Hephaestus has been, I think, your most valuable and unexpected ally in that chamber. She does not care for careful diplomatic evasion, and she made the moral stakes of this plainly, bluntly clear in a way that several gods present found considerably harder to look away from than they would have preferred. And the rest? Rexar asked. Divided, largely, along predictable lines. Some see opportunity, a new and untested source of power, worth courting or recruiting before a rival familia does. Some see threat, and will argue, quietly or otherwise, for containment or worse. Miak and a handful of the smaller, gentler familias have expressed cautious sympathy toward the Xenos' cause, though they lack the raw strength to meaningfully shift the council's balance on their own. Orario paused, and something more careful entered his weathered voice. And then there is Freya. Bane's ears flicked forward at the particular weight the god placed on that name. You are concerned about her specifically. I am always to some degree concerned about Freya, Orario admitted. She is patient, and she is powerful beyond nearly any other deity in this city, and she has a long, well-documented history of taking a particular, possessive interest in beings of unusual strength or beauty. I do not say this to alarm you unduly. I say it because I would rather you enter this meeting with clear eyes about every party in that chamber, rather than discover the shape of the danger only after it has already closed around you. Rexar exchanged a glance with Bane, with Rokan, with Lorthamar, and felt the familiar, steadying weight of a decision already made settle over the party, regardless of the fresh warning. We didn't come this far to start second-guessing ourselves now, he said. Whatever's waiting in that chamber, curiosity, danger, both at once. We'll face it the same way we've faced everything else since that rift tore us out of our own world. Together, and honest about exactly who we are and what we intend. Orario studied him for a long moment, and something in the ancient god's weathered expression carried, unmistakably, the particular gratitude of someone who had waited a very long time to finally have allies willing to walk directly into the fire alongside him. Then let us prepare you, the god said. For the first time, Orario's gods will look upon you directly and judge for themselves exactly what kind of storm has arrived beneath their city. That evening, as the party made their final preparations for the formal introduction Ganesha's familia had arranged 3 days hence, Kalia found Rexar alone, near the sanctuary's edge, staring out at the slow drift of blue motes across the cavern's impossible ceiling. "You are worried," she said. It wasn't a question. Kalia had spent enough of her long, strange existence learning to read the particular stillness of people carrying more weight than they let show. "Not about the fight, if it comes to one," Rexar admitted. "About everything after. Oranos is right to warn us about Freya, and even setting her aside. We're about to walk into a room full of gods who've spent 100 years building an entire civilization on the idea that power should answer to divine blessing. We're about to tell them, to their faces, that we don't need it, and that we've already chosen to stand against the exact system that keeps most of them in power." He shook his head slowly. "That's not a conversation that ends without cost. I've started enough fights in my life to know the shape of one coming before it arrives." "Perhaps," Kalia said quietly, "but I have also learned, across a death and a long, difficult reclamation afterward, that some costs are worth paying regardless of how heavy they prove to be." She looked out at the drifting lights beside him, something old and steady in her pale, composed features. "I was once a princess of a kingdom that fell to exactly the kind of fear this city has built its whole society upon. The fear of what we do not understand, dressed up as righteous necessity. I did not choose that fall, but I chose, afterward, painstakingly, what I would become in its wake. I chose reclamation over bitterness, mercy over the vengeance a great many of my people believed I owed the living world." Her gaze shifted to him, steady. "This is no different, Rexar. We did not choose to fall into this world, but we choose, now, exactly what we become in it. I would rather face whatever cost that choosing brings than spend one more day pretending we could have walked past what we saw in that first chamber and called it wisdom instead of cowardice." Rexar was quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words settling steady beside the weight of his own resolve. "No," he agreed finally. "No, I don't suppose either of us would." Above them, the drifting blue lights continued their slow, patient dance across the cavern's ceiling, indifferent to the storm gathering 3 days out, a storm that would, when it finally broke across Orario's gathered gods, prove to be only the first of many the city would need to weather before this story found its ending. The chamber Ganesha's familia had prepared for the formal introduction sat within a converted training hall beneath the guild's central tower, vast enough to accommodate the assembled council of gods and their chosen representatives, ringed with Ganesha familia's own adventurers stationed at careful intervals, ostensibly for security, though Rexar noted with a beastmaster's practiced eye that half of them seemed more focused on watching the gathering gods than any potential threat from the strangers they'd been assigned to observe. He understood the caution. A room full of divine power, however carefully composed its outward manners, was still a room that could turn dangerous in the span of a single wrong word. They entered together, Rexar at the front, flanked by Bane's steady bulk and Lorthamar's watchful readiness, Rokan and Kalia a step behind, Gazlo trailing with rather less caution than the moment strictly called for, already craning his neck at the unfamiliar architecture with undisguised engineering curiosity. Bell walked with them, having insisted, against Oranos's gentle suggestion that he might prefer to remain uninvolved in the more dangerous diplomatic exposure, that he would not let them face this alone. The assembled gods studied them with an intensity that Rexar had felt before, on other battlefields, from other powers, the particular weighing scrutiny of those accustomed to holding every advantage in a room, suddenly confronted with something they could not immediately place on the familiar scale of threat and value. Loki broke the silence first, leaning forward with open, undisguised interest. "So you're the ones who took a broodmother's head off in one swing. Gotta say, expected something a little more." Her sharp eyes swept over Rexar's considerable bulk. "Actually, no. Checks out." "Loki," Finn murmured beside her, a note of caution in his quiet voice. What? I'm being complimentary. Loki's grin sharpened. So, no Falna, no God's blessing at all. That true? True, Rexar confirmed. Where we're from, power doesn't work the way it does here. We grow strong through our own trial, our own choices, training, experience, will. Some of us carry gifts from birth, some don't. None of it answers to any God's grant. A ripple of low murmur moved through the assembled deities at that, plain confirmation of what Ganesha's earlier report had already suggested, but hearing it stated so directly seemed to land differently. And yet you fight, said a new voice, quieter, more clinical, a god Rexar didn't recognize, though Fells murmured a quick identification at his shoulder, Apollo's replacement seat, filled temporarily by a minor deity named Dionysus, watching with more careful attention than his relaxed posture suggested. You fight, and by all reports, fight exceptionally well. I confess I find that curious. What is the ceiling of power a being can reach, without any Falna to guide or accelerate their growth? Higher than you might expect, Bane said, before Rexar could answer. Though I would caution against reducing what we are to a simple measure of ceiling and capability. We did not come here to be assessed like livestock at auction. The blunt correction landed with visible weight across the chamber, and Dionysus inclined his head, something almost respectful in the gesture. Fair enough. My apologies for the framing. It was then that Freya spoke, and the whole chamber's attention shifted instantly, involuntarily, toward her the way a tide shifts toward the moon. I find myself considerably more curious, she said, voice carrying that same effortless, gravity-bending quality Rexar had been warned about what drove 6 such capable beings to choose, within hours of arriving in an unfamiliar world, to defend creatures this city has spent a century training its people to fear and kill. That is not merely a matter of capability. That is a matter of character. And character, I have found, tells one considerably more about a being's true worth than raw strength ever does. Her pale eyes settled on Rexar directly, and he felt the full, unsettling weight of her attention, not overtly threatening, not even unkind exactly, but carrying an unmistakable, appraising hunger that made every instinct in his body quietly, firmly assert itself against. We've spent our whole lives being told which side of a line we belonged on by people who never bothered looking closely enough to draw it honestly, Rexar said, holding her gaze without flinching, because he had learned long ago that showing weakness to a predator only ever invited more attention, not less. We know what that costs. We weren't about to walk past the same cruelty happening to someone else and call it none of our business. How admirable, Freya said, and something in the soft, considering way she said it made more than one god in the chamber shift uncomfortably in their seats. I do wonder, Rexar of the Horde, whether such loyalty might be persuaded to extend itself a little further. With respect, Bane said, stepping fractionally forward, his quiet gravity carrying an unmistakable edge of warning beneath its calm. Our loyalty is not a resource available for negotiation. We have chosen our position. We do not intend to be courted away from it, however flattering the offer. A long, taut silence followed, Freya's composed expression giving away nothing at all of whatever calculation moved behind it, until finally, unexpectedly, something that might almost have been amusement touched the corner of her mouth. Very well, she said, and let the matter drop with a lightness that fooled no one in the chamber into believing it was truly finished. I shall simply have to content myself with watching how this unfolds then. I do so enjoy a story with an interesting shape to it. The council's questioning continued for the better part of 2 hours. Practical matters, mostly. Once the initial tension eased into something more workable, the party's intentions regarding residents in the city, their relationship to the guild's registration system, the delicate question of how the Xenos' existence might now be formally, carefully acknowledged without triggering the kind of citywide panic that had, more than once in Orario's history, ended in bloodshed disproportionate to whatever initial provocation sparked it. Hephaestus, blunt and practical as ever, cut through much of the diplomatic hedging with characteristic directness. Here's what I actually want to know. If Orario's laws don't change, if the guild keeps classifying Xenos as monsters to be culled on sight, same as it's always done, what do you six actually do about it? Because from where I'm sitting, you didn't come here asking permission. You came here already having made a choice. I want to know how far that choice goes. The chamber went quiet, waiting. As far as it needs to, Rexar said simply. We're not looking to burn this city down or force anyone's hand through violence they didn't choose for themselves. But we're not going to stand by and watch Xenos hunted for existing either. If the law doesn't change, we'll keep protecting who we can regardless of what the law says. That's not a threat. That's just the truth of who we are. And if the guild decides that makes you a threat to be contained? Ganesha asked, not unkindly, but with the careful weight of someone who needed the answer plainly on record. Then I suppose we'll have that conversation when it comes, Rexar said, but I'd rather have it honestly, in the open, than pretend we're something softer than we are just to make this room more comfortable. Something in the bluntness of that answer seemed, unexpectedly, to land well across a surprising portion of the gathered council, Loki's grin sharpening with genuine approval, Hephaestus giving a short, satisfied nod, even Dionysus's careful, clinical attention shifting into something closer to grudging respect. Uranos, watching from where he stood near the chamber's edge, allowed himself, for the first time in longer than Fells could easily recall, something that looked very much like relief. It was as the council began, at last, to wind toward its close, Ganesha proposing a formal probationary period, during which the stranger's status and the broader question of the Xenos' legal treatment would be reviewed in stages, a compromise that satisfied no single faction entirely, but which the majority of the room seemed cautiously willing to accept. That the chamber's doors opened unannounced, and a new arrival swept in with a confidence that suggested she'd expected and received. "Forgive my lateness," Ishtar said, her voice carrying a honeyed, performative warmth that did nothing to disguise the sharp calculation beneath it. "I heard there was quite the fascinating gathering underway, and I simply couldn't resist seeing for myself." Her eyes swept the chamber, lingering with open, unhidden appraisal across Rexar's party, and settling, with particular interest, on Lorthamar's sharp elven features. My. Orario has been positively starved for something new and interesting, and here it seems 6 of you have arrived all at once. "Ishtar," Ganesha said, careful diplomacy tightening at the edges, "this council session is not open to uninvited attendance." "I'm hardly uninvited, dear Ganesha, merely unannounced. There's a difference." Ishtar's attention had not moved from the party, her painted smile widening by degrees. "I simply wish to extend an invitation of my own, before the rest of this city's familias inevitably queue up to make their own offers. My familia has resources this city's more modest household simply cannot match. Wealth, influence, pleasures, this world has scarcely begun to imagine." Her gaze flicked, briefly, deliberately, toward Lorthamar again. "I find myself particularly curious what other gifts you 6 might carry with you, beyond mere combat prowess." "We appreciate the interest," Rexar said, keeping his voice level despite the distaste curling in his chest at the transparent, predatory framing of the offer. "But we're not for sale, or for trade, or for whatever else this is meant to be. Our answer's the same as it was to Freya's asking. We've chosen our position." Ishtar's painted smile didn't waver, though something colder flickered briefly beneath it. "How very principled," she said, in a tone that made plain exactly how little she valued the quality. "Well, principles have a way of proving flexible, given time and the right incentive. I shall simply have to be patient." She inclined her head with theatrical grace toward the wider council. "My apologies again for the interruption. Do carry on." She swept out as abruptly as she'd arrived, leaving behind a chamber whose tension had ratcheted several degrees tighter in her brief passage through it. "That," Fells murmured quietly at Rexar's shoulder, once the doors had closed behind her, "was Ishtar. I would advise considerable caution regarding any future dealings with her familia. She does not accept refusal gracefully, and her methods for eventually securing what she wants are rarely so straightforward as a second polite offer." "Noted," Rexar said grimly, filing the warning away alongside Oranos's earlier caution about Freya. The council session finally closed with Ganesha's probationary compromise formally adopted. A fragile, carefully worded first step that satisfied no one entirely, but which offered for the first time in the Xenos' long-hidden history something like an official, acknowledged path forward, rather than perpetual, precarious secrecy. Bell found Rexar afterward, in a quiet corridor outside the chamber, and there was something bright and disbelieving in the young adventurer's expression that hadn't been there when they'd entered hours before. "I never thought I'd see this happen," Bell admitted. "Not really. I always figured the best I could do was keep protecting who I could quietly, and hope it was enough. I didn't let myself believe the whole city might actually start talking about changing the law itself." "It's one step," Rexar cautioned, though he couldn't fully suppress the note of genuine satisfaction in his own voice. "A fragile one. Plenty of people in that room still see us as either a threat to contain or a prize to win, and I don't think either Freya or Ishtar are done trying to figure out which." "Maybe," Bell said, "but it's a step that didn't exist yesterday. That has to count for something." Rexar looked at the young adventurer, earnest, hopeful, carrying a weight of quiet courage that belied his slight frame, and felt something warm settle alongside the wariness still coiled in his chest from Ishtar's pointed, predatory interest. "It counts for a lot," he said. "Come on, let's get back to the others and tell them how it went. Vila and Ilsa deserve to hear it from us directly, not filtered through whatever version of the story the city's rumor mill cooks up by morning." They walked back together through Orario's gathering evening light, and behind them, in the emptying council chamber, Oranos remained a long while after the last god had departed, staring at the space where the 6 strangers had stood, weighing everything the day had revealed. The fragile progress won, the dangerous new attention now fixed upon them from at least 2 of the city's most formidable and least trustworthy deities, and the long, uncertain road still stretching ahead before this story's true shape could be known. "One battle won," Fells observed quietly at his shoulder. "One battle won," Oranos agreed, weary but, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely hopeful. "I fear it is only the first of a great many still to come." Ishtar Familia's manor sat deep within the district Orario's more genteel citizens preferred not to discuss in polite company, its opulent facade a deliberate contradiction to the harder, more transactional business conducted within its walls. Ishtar herself received the report in her private chambers 3 days after Denatus, reclined among silk cushions with the particular languid patience of a goddess who had learned, across centuries, that the best schemes were rarely the hasty ones. "Tell me again," she said, "about the pale one." "The one with the bow." Billis, one of her familia's more capable information gatherers, bowed low before continuing. "Lorthamar Theron, my lady. By the accounts we've gathered, he holds some manner of leadership role among the strangers, a captain of sorts, though not the outright strongest of them. Disciplined, reserved. Our informants within Ganesha Familia report he was notably resistant to your invitation." "Resistance is only interesting the first time," Ishtar said, examining her own painted nails with idle disinterest that fooled no one who knew her well. "What else?" There is also concerning intelligence regarding the undead one. Kalia Menethil, she is called, priestess, of some fashion, though her magic does not match anything in the guild's registry of divine or arcane traditions. Freya's familia has already begun making discreet inquiries about her specifically. It's said Otter himself requested a private meeting. Ishtar's idle expression sharpened by a fraction at that. Freya moves quickly when something interests her. There is one more matter, my lady. Evilis. Bilis's voice dropped lower, careful, even within the privacy of Ishtar's own chambers. Word has reached certain of our contacts that Enyo's agents have taken a considerable interest in the strangers as well, not in recruiting them, as Freya or ourselves might attempt, but in assessing whether their arrival represents a vulnerability that might be exploited, or a threat that ought to be eliminated before it grows further entangled with Oranos's affairs. Ishtar was quiet for a long moment, turning that particular piece of intelligence over with the careful calculation that had kept her familia thriving, in its own dark fashion, for as long as it had. Then we shall simply have to move carefully, she said finally, and ensure that whatever Evilis intends, my familia benefits from the outcome, regardless of which way this ultimately falls. Continue watching them. I want to know everything, their habits, their weaknesses, anyone among them who might prove persuadable, given the right approach. And if none of them prove persuadable, my lady, Ishtar's smile turned, briefly, considerably less warm than her usual practiced charm, then we shall have to become considerably more creative about what persuasion looks like. The Evilis concern Bilis had raised was not, as it happened, mere familia gossip. 3 floors below the district where Ishtar's manor sat, in a chamber hidden deep within Knossos' less charted ruins, a cloaked figure knelt before an altar that pulsed with a corrupted, sickly variant of the same blue crystal light that lit the wider dungeon, and spoke into the dark with the particular reverent care of someone addressing a power considerably greater than themselves. They grow stronger in the city's regard with each passing day, the figure said. Oranos has used them to force Denatus' hand on the Xenos question in a manner he never dared attempt alone in 100 years of careful patience. If this is allowed to continue unchecked, the sanctuaries we have spent so long tracking and cataloging for eventual harvest may become formally protected beyond our reach. The response that came was not a voice, precisely, more a pressure, a weight settling across the chamber's cold air, communicating meaning without the need for words a mortal throat could easily have shaped. Then, remove the threat before it roots too deeply, but do so with care. 6 beings capable of felling a broodmother in a single stroke, wielding power outside any Falna's registry, are not a threat to be tested carelessly. Watch them, learn their weaknesses, and when the moment is right, strike where it will cost them the most, not at their strength, but at what they have chosen to protect. The cloaked figure bowed low, the shape of a plan already beginning to form behind eyes that had, across a long service to Evilis's patient cause, learned precisely how much damage could be done by striking not at strength, but at love. Rexar knew none of this, of course, as the party settled into the slower, more careful rhythm of the days following Denatus, a rhythm that felt, after the chaos of arrival and confrontation, almost disorienting in its relative calm. Oranos had arranged modest quarters for them within Knossos' more habitable ruins, close enough to both the Deep and Weena's sanctuary to move easily between the two, and the party spent much of those first quieter days doing the unglamorous, essential work of actually understanding the world they'd fallen into. Gazlo, predictably, threw himself into cataloging Orario's magic item economy with undisguised delight, spending long hours at Hephaestus Familia's forges, an arrangement Hephaestus herself had arranged with characteristic bluntness after their earlier exchange at Denatus. Recognizing in the goblin's tinkering enthusiasm something genuinely useful to a smithing operation always hungry for fresh technique. "You're telling me," Gazlo said, on his third visit, turning a half-finished piece of Hephaestus forged armor over in his hands with reverent care, "that this whole city runs on enchantment work, this refined, and nobody's thought to combine it with proper engineering. Do you have any idea what I could build with materials like this?" "I have some idea," Hephaestus said dryly, watching the goblin's rapid, excited sketching, with an expression that suggested she was already reconsidering several assumptions about the ceiling of her own craft. "Show me." Rokan, meanwhile, spent his days accompanying Bell and Welf on lower-floor expeditions, quietly, methodically testing the dungeon's response to his particular brand of shadow magic against its native monsters, cataloging with a hunter's careful patience exactly which effects translated cleanly and which met unexpected resistance. "Interesting," he told Rexar one evening, sharpening his blades by the sanctuary's amber firelight. "Standard monsters, my shadow tricks work fine on, but some of the tougher ones, they got something in them that pushes back against illusion magic in particular. Like something in this dungeon knows what it is, and knows how to guard against it specific." "You think the dungeon's actively adapting to us?" Rexar said. "I think," Rokan said slowly, "this dungeon been alive and thinking a lot longer than anybody up in that pretty city wants to admit. And I think it's paying real close attention to 6 strangers who don't fit any pattern it's ever had to reckon with before." It was a thought that unsettled Rexar more than he let show, echoing as it did Bane's own earlier warnings about the strange, watchful weight he'd felt in the dungeon's ancient stone since their arrival. It was Kalia, several days into this quieter rhythm, who received the first sign of the more immediate danger gathering around them. A visit, unannounced and carefully cordial, from a towering, heavily armored figure whose presence alone was enough to draw the attention of every adventurer within sight the moment he entered Knossos' outer ruins. "Autar," Fels murmured, quiet warning threading through the single word. "Freya Familia's captain, the strongest adventurer in this city, by a considerable margin. He does not make personal visits lightly." Autar's approach, when it came, carried none of the predatory theatricality Ishtar had displayed at Denatus, only a blunt, formal directness that felt, in its own way, considerably more unsettling for its complete lack of pretense. "Kalia Menethil," he said, inclining his head in a gesture of respect that seemed to cost him nothing despite his imposing bearing. "Lady Freya requests your presence, at your convenience, for private conversation. She wishes to discuss the nature of your magic, and asks that I convey her assurance that this invitation carries no obligation beyond conversation itself." Kalia studied the massive warrior for a long moment, her pale, composed features giving away little of whatever calculation moved behind them. "And if I decline, then I will convey your decline, and Lady Freya will accept it," Autar said simply. "She does not force what she cannot win honestly. Though I will say, from my own observation across many years in her service, her patience for eventually winning what interests her honestly is considerably longer than most beings' capacity to keep declining." It was, Rexar thought, watching the exchange with careful attention, both the most honest and the most quietly ominous warning Freya's Familia had offered them yet. "I will consider it," Kalia said finally, "and give my answer within the week." Autar accepted this with a short nod, and departed as unceremoniously as he'd arrived, leaving behind a small gathering of the party, considerably more unsettled than the brief, polite exchange might have suggested to an outside observer. "She's not going to stop," Bane said quietly, once the warrior's massive form had disappeared from view. "Freya, I mean." Autar's honesty about her patience was, I think, exactly the warning it appeared to be. "No," Kalia agreed. "I do not believe she will. but I find I am not entirely opposed to the conversation itself, whatever comes of it. I have spent a long, strange existence being feared for what I am, rather than understood for it. A goddess genuinely curious about the nature of forsaken magic, rather than merely afraid of it, is not nothing, even if her curiosity carries its own considerable danger alongside it. That same evening, in the hidden sanctuary where Ween and the broader Xenos community had, in the days since Denatus's fragile compromise, begun cautiously, carefully imagining a future beyond perpetual hiding, a different and far more urgent conversation was unfolding, one that would, within another day, force the whole party's careful, quiet rhythm to shatter entirely. "There are strange scouts," Weena reported, urgency threading through her careful, halting speech, as she found Bell and Rokan near the sanctuary's edge. "Not adventurers, not guild patrols either. I know their movements, their patterns. These are different, careful, watching from a distance, retreating before we can identify them clearly. 3 times now, in as many days." Rokan's expression sharpened instantly into the careful, weighing focus of a hunter recognizing the signs of being hunted in turn. "Evilous," he said, with grim certainty. "Gotta be. Nobody else got reason to be scouting a hidden Xenos sanctuary discareful, disquiet." Bell's face went pale. "If they know where the sanctuary is, then we move fast, and we move smart," Rokan said, already turning to gather the rest of the party. "'Cause if Evilous is scouting this place careful, instead of just striking, that means they planning something bigger than a simple raid. And I got a real bad feeling about exactly what that bigger something's gonna cost us, if we don't get ahead of it first." Above them, in the ordinary golden light of an Orario evening that had no idea yet how close it stood to a danger considerably darker than gossip or divine curiosity, the fragile, hopeful peace the party had spent the last several days carefully building began, for the first time since their arrival, to show its first genuine cracks. They moved the sanctuary's most vulnerable members that same night, the elderly, the very young, Ilsa included, relocated under Vela's watchful care to a deeper, more defensible chamber within the deep, while the rest of the party worked through the small hours mapping every approach to Vena's original sanctuary, every blind spot, every choke point that a hostile force might exploit. "We can't defend 2 locations at once," Lorthamar said, studying the crude map Gazlo had sketched from memory across a flat stretch of stone, his Farstrider's training evident in the sharp, economical way he assessed the terrain. "If Evilous strikes here while we're spread thin protecting the deep, or strikes the deep while we're concentrated here, we lose whichever location we're not watching. Then we don't split evenly," Rokan said. "We put our strongest defense where they most likely to hit first, and we make sure we got fast warning if they hit the other." "They'll hit here first," Asterius said, arriving from the deep with 3 of his own kind. Xenos warriors Rexar hadn't yet been introduced to, but whose readiness for violence was evident in the grim set of their expressions and the weapons they carried without hesitation. Ween's sanctuary is smaller, less defended, and closer to the surface routes Evilous agents would find easier to access without drawing guild attention. "If I were planning this attack, I would strike the softer target first, and use whatever chaos it created to mask a second strike on the deep while attention was divided." "You've thought about this before," Bane observed. "I have had to," Asterius said, something old and weary in his intelligent dark eyes. "We have survived this long, Bane of the Tauren, precisely because we never stopped planning for exactly this kind of night." The attack came 2 nights later, and it came, as Asterius had predicted, at the smaller sanctuary. Though not, Rexar realized within the first chaotic minutes, in the shape any of them had fully anticipated. It began with fire. Not natural fire, but something laced with a corrupted magic that ate through stone and mineral fiber alike with unnatural hunger, erupting simultaneously at 3 points around the sanctuary's perimeter in a coordinated strike that spoke of careful, patient planning rather than any hasty opportunistic raid. "Positions," Rexar bellowed, already moving, axe in hand, as the sanctuary's Xenos scattered into the defensive formations they'd spent the last 2 days drilling. "Lorthamar, high ground. Find the source of that fire. Bane, shore up the western passage before it collapses entirely." The attackers emerged from the smoke and chaos in numbers that made clear, immediately, that this was no probing scout force but a genuine assault. Cloaked figures moving with disciplined, coordinated precision, wielding corrupted magic that pulsed the same sickly variant of blue crystal light Rexar had, without knowing it, already been warned about by the cloaked figure's altar-side report 3 days prior. Rexar met the first wave head-on, axe carving through the leading attacker's guard with the same brutal efficiency that had ended the Broodmother days before. But these were not mindless monsters. These fought with tactics, with coordination, falling back and regrouping with a discipline that told him plainly he was facing trained soldiers rather than opportunistic raiders. Evilous cultists, Fells confirmed grimly, arriving at Rexar's flank in a blur of unnatural motion, skeletal hands already weaving some counter-magic against the corrupted fire spreading through the sanctuary's outer structures. Trained and considerably better equipped than the usual rabble Enyos forces typically deploy for a raid of this scale. This was planned with real resources behind it. "Then let's give them a reason to regret spending those resources on us," Rexar growled, and threw himself back into the fight. The battle that followed was brutal and prolonged, the sanctuary's narrow passages becoming a maze of fire and steel and corrupted magic, as the party fought to hold ground against an enemy that seemed, disturbingly, to have anticipated much of their defensive strategy in advance. Bane's earth magic shored up collapsing passages even as corrupted fire ate at their edges. Kalia's reclaimed light burned through cultist ranks even as she worked to counter the worst of the spreading flame. Rokan moved through the chaos like a shadow given purpose, his shadow magic finding gaps in the attacker's coordination that a less experienced hunter would never have noticed. It was Lorthamar, from his elevated position, who spotted the true danger first. A second wave, emerging from a passage none of them had flagged as vulnerable, moving with clear purpose toward the sanctuary's deeper chambers, where the last of the community's more vulnerable members were still being evacuated. "They're flanking," he shouted, already redirecting his fire, arrows finding throats and joints with brutal precision, even as he called the warning. "Second wave, moving on the inner chambers. Rexar, they're not here for a straightforward fight. They're trying to get past us entirely." Rexar's blood went cold with sudden, total clarity. Not a raid, a snatch. "Bane, hold the western passage. Don't let anything else through," he bellowed, already breaking from the main engagement, Misha surging at his heel. "Rokan, with me. We need to cut off that second wave before they reach the inner chambers." They ran, the sanctuary's familiar layout blurring past in the chaos of firelight and smoke, and Rexar arrived at the inner passage just as the flanking force reached its terminus, a knot of cloaked cultists converging on a small group of fleeing Xenos, weapons raised, and at their center, directing the assault with cold, clinical precision, the same cloaked figure who had knelt before Evilus's corrupted altar 3 nights before. "Rexar of the Horde," the figure said, voice carrying a cold, calculating amusement, entirely unlike the desperate rabble he'd expected. "How generous of you to arrive personally. It will save my agents considerably more effort than the alternative would have required." "Whatever you're here for," Rexar said, planting himself between the cultists and the fleeing Xenos, axe raised. "You're not getting it." "Oh, I don't doubt you'll make it difficult," the figure said, something in the cold amusement sharpening into genuine, unsettling anticipation. But you misunderstand the purpose of tonight's exercise, Beastmaster. We are not here merely to strike at the Xenos, though their eventual harvest remains a matter of considerable ongoing interest to my patron. Tonight, we are here to learn precisely what it costs to make 6 strangers from beyond the stars bleed, and precisely which of you bleeds fastest when pushed hard enough. The fight that followed was the hardest Rexxar had faced since arriving in this strange new world. The cultist leader wielding corrupted magic that twisted and warped even as it struck, forcing Rexxar into a defensive, reactive posture entirely unlike his usual brutal, forward-driving style. Rokhan fought at his flank with grim, focused intensity, shadow blades finding gaps in the cultist's formation, even as more corrupted fire licked at the passage's edges, threatening to collapse the whole structure around them. It was a near thing, closer than Rexxar would later admit comfortably to the rest of the party. But between his own brute strength and Rokhan's precise, shadow-guided strikes, the cultist leader finally fell, corrupted magic guttering out as the figure collapsed, and the remaining cultists, leaderless and suddenly exposed, broke and fled into the dark rather than face 2 Horde warriors with their blood well and truly up. The aftermath, when the fires were finally contained and the sanctuary's damage assessed in the gray, exhausted hours before whatever passed for dawn this deep in the dungeon, was sobering in ways that went beyond the physical destruction. 3 Xenos had died in the attack, a toll that Weena bore with a grief so quiet and so total that Bell, sitting beside her in the wreckage of what had been her home for years, found himself unable to offer any comfort adequate to the weight of it. "This is what always happens," Ween said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Every time we begin to hope, every time we let ourselves imagine a future beyond hiding, something arrives to remind us exactly how fragile that hope truly is." "This wasn't your fault," Bell said quietly. "It wasn't Rexxar's fault, or mine, or anyone's but the people who set that fire tonight. We can't let this convince us the hoping itself was the mistake." Ween was quiet for a long moment, grief and something more determined warring visibly across her exhausted features. "No," she said finally. "No, I do not think it was. But I think, after tonight, we cannot pretend any longer that hope alone will be enough to protect us. Whatever comes next, we need more than good intentions. We need a real defense, a real place, protected not merely by secrecy, but by strength enough to make an attack like tonight's too costly for anyone to attempt again." Rexxar, overhearing this exchange as he worked through the grim, necessary business of tending the wounded and assessing what remained of the sanctuary's defenses, felt the weight of Weena's words settle heavy and certain in his own chest. "She's right," he said, joining Bell and Weena, Misha limping slightly at his side from a wound sustained in the fighting, but otherwise steady. "We drove them off tonight, but that cultist as good as told me this was a test. Learning our weaknesses, testing our limits, before whatever comes next. We can't keep reacting to each strike after the fact. We need to get ahead of this." "What are you thinking?" Bell asked. "I'm thinking," Rexxar said slowly, working the shape of it out even as he spoke, "that it's time we stopped treating this as a problem to manage quietly, in the shadows, and started treating it as the open fight it's already become. Oranos wanted the truth to surface carefully, in stages, so the city could adjust without panic. But Evilis just made clear they're not waiting for that careful timeline. If we don't move faster than they're moving, we're going to keep losing people like we lost 3 tonight." Bane, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the exchange, nodded slowly, grim agreement settling across his broad features. "I agree. Whatever careful diplomatic path Oranos hoped to walk, Evilis has just forced our hand. I think it is time we spoke plainly with the wider city about exactly what threat the Xenos, and by extension, all of us, now face, and asked for the kind of open, allied strength that secrecy alone can no longer provide. "You're talking about asking Orario's familias for help," Bell said, something cautiously hopeful entering his exhausted voice. "Openly. Not just tolerance. Actual alliance." "I'm talking about exactly that," Rexar confirmed. "Because I don't think we can win the fight that's coming with 6 of us and a handful of Xenos warriors alone, however capable we are. And I think, after tonight, Orario needs to understand plainly what it's actually being asked to choose between. Quiet indifference that lets things like this keep happening in the dark, or open commitment to something better, whatever that commitment costs." Above them, in the wreckage of a sanctuary that had, for one brief and hopeful week, begun to imagine a future beyond hiding, the gray light of a dungeon dawn that would never truly come began its slow, indifferent creep across stone still smoking from corrupted fire. And far above that, in a city whose gods had only just begun to reckon with what 6 strangers from beyond the stars truly meant for its future, the true scale of the storm gathering beneath their streets remained, for one more day, still dangerously, precariously unknown. Ganesha convened an emergency session within 2 days, this time smaller and more urgent than the full ceremony of Denatus, a working council of the city's most capable martial familias, called specifically to address what the sanctuary attack had made unmistakably clear. Whatever quiet, careful diplomatic timeline Oranos had originally hoped to walk, Evilus had no intention of allowing it. 3 dead, Ganesha said, laying the report plainly before the gathered representatives. Loki and Finn for Loki Familia, Otar standing silent at the chamber's edge in Freya's stead, Hephaestus herself rather than a proxy, and Oranos with Fells a step behind him. Coordinated, well-resourced, and by every indication Evilus directed, this is no longer a matter of quietly managing public perception of the Xenos. This is a matter of active, ongoing threat to lives already under this city's moral obligation to protect, whether our laws currently recognize that obligation or not. "You're asking us to commit familia resources to defending Xenos sanctuaries," Finn said, not unkindly, but with the careful precision of a captain who needed the terms plainly stated before any commitment could be made. "That's a significant ask, Ganesha. Loki Familia's strength exists to keep this city's dungeon expeditions from ending in disaster, not to take sides in what's been, until very recently, a quiet legal gray area most of Orario preferred not examining too closely. With respect," Rexar said, stepping forward. "It stopped being a gray area the moment cultists set fire to a home full of children trying to sleep. I'm not asking anyone in this room to fight a war they don't believe in. I'm telling you plainly what we saw, and asking whether the familias of this city are willing to stand against people who burn children alive, to make a point, regardless of what those children happen to look like." The blunt framing landed hard across the chamber, and Loki, for once, let her usual sharp humor fall away entirely. "You don't pull punches, do you?" she said, something genuinely weighing behind her sharp eyes. "All right, here's my honest answer, strangers. Loki Familia's not going to commit to some open-ended guardian duty over every Xenos sanctuary in this dungeon. We've got our own people to think about, our own obligations. But Evilus setting up shop this deep, this organized, this close to the surface, that's a threat to this whole city, not just to the Xenos. You give us solid intelligence on where their operations are rooted, and Loki Familia will absolutely commit to helping root them out. That's not charity. That's self-interest lining up real nice with doing the right thing for once." "That's more than fair," Rexar said, something like real relief loosening in his chest. "We'll take it." Hephaestus spoke next, characteristically blunt. "My familia can't offer combat support the way Loki's can, but I can offer something else. Better defenses. Real fortification for these sanctuaries, forged properly, not scavenged mineral fiber that burns the first time someone throws corrupted fire at it. Gazlo's already been working alongside my smiths. Between his engineering and our enchantment work, I think we can build something considerably harder to burn down next time. Ottar, silent until now, finally spoke, his deep voice carrying the same blunt formality he'd shown in his earlier visit to Kalia. Lady Freya has instructed me to convey her familia's interest in offering protection as well, though she asks that I be plain about the nature of that offer. It is not without cost. She would want something in return. Specifically, his gaze shifted, briefly, deliberately, toward Kalia. Continued conversation and consideration regarding matters already discussed between them. Kalia's composed features didn't shift, though Rexar caught the faint, careful weighing in her pale eyes. "I have not forgotten Lady Freya's invitation," she said. "I intend to honor it, in my own time, on my own terms. But I will not pretend that offering protection for the Xenos in exchange for leverage over one member of our party sits entirely comfortably with me, however genuinely useful Freya Familia's strength would prove." "Freya's terms are rarely so crude as simple exchange," Ottar said, something almost gentle entering his blunt voice. "She does not demand what you are unwilling to give freely. She merely makes clear that she is patient, and that she values genuine connection over coerced obligation. I would not have conveyed her offer if I believed otherwise." The chamber settled into a thoughtful, weighing quiet, the fragile shape of an alliance beginning, cautiously, to take form. Imperfect, transactional in places, genuine in others, but real in a way that Rexar recognized, from long experience building coalitions on his own world, as considerably more durable than anything built purely on idealism alone. The days that followed brought a shift in rhythm that felt, to Rexar, almost dizzying after the sanctuary's fire and the fragile diplomatic dance that preceded it. Loki Familia's scouts beginning careful, methodical reconnaissance of the dungeon's deeper, less charted regions, in search of Evilus's hidden operations. Hephaestus Familia's smiths working alongside Gazlo on fortifications that combined Orario's enchantment traditions with engineering principles the city had never before considered. And slowly, steadily, word beginning to spread through Orario's streets. Not merely rumor now, but a growing, uneasy public awareness that something fundamental about the city's understanding of itself was shifting. Not everyone welcomed the shift. Rexar felt the cold edge of that resistance directly on a rare trip up to the surface, escorting Bell on a supply run through Orario's busier districts, when a cluster of adventurers outside a weapon shop went quiet and wary at his approach, hands drifting instinctively toward hilts. "That's one of them," he heard one mutter, not quite quiet enough. "The ones defending the monsters. Heard they're not even blessed. Just wandering around this city like they own it, telling the guild how things ought to work." "Ignore them," Bell murmured, though his own jaw was tight with quiet anger on Rexar's behalf. "I've had worse said about me," Rexar said, and meant it, though the particular flavor of this world's suspicion, layered as it was on top of a century of careful ideological conditioning about exactly what counted as a person, carried its own distinct weight he was still learning to carry. People don't change 100 years of belief overnight just because 6 strangers showed up and made a fuss. That's not failure. That's just how long change actually takes. Most places I've seen it happen. Doesn't make it easier to hear, Bell said. "No," Rexar agreed. "It never does." It was Bane, several days later, who brought the party's attention to a complication none of them had yet fully considered. A matter that arrived not through hostility, but through the more complicated, morally fraught territory of competing obligation. "There is a settlement," the tauren chieftain said, gathering the party in the quiet of their Knossos quarters, "called Telskura. Fells tells me it is a remote village, largely self-sufficient, populated by descendants of a Xenos and human union generations past. Beings who exist, in the eyes of Orario's law, in an even more precarious position than the Xenos we have already sworn to protect. Neither fully accepted as human, nor fully classified as monster. They have survived, until now, largely through isolation and careful secrecy. And now? Rexar asked. Now, word of our arrival, and of the growing public conversation around the Xenos, has reached them as well, Bane said. Fells has received word that their elders are divided, some hopeful that this changing tide might finally offer them a path toward open acceptance, others deeply fearful that the increased attention on Xenos-adjacent matters will draw exactly the kind of scrutiny that has kept them safe through isolation for generations. They have asked, cautiously, whether we would be willing to visit, to hear their concerns directly, before any further public momentum makes their choice for them. Rexar felt the weight of the request settle heavy in his chest, the first genuinely difficult moral knot the party had faced since arriving, one without a clean answer, regardless of which way they chose. To visit and lend their support risked accelerating exactly the kind of scrutiny some of Telskura's own people feared. To decline, out of respect for that fear, risked abandoning a community whose situation mirrored, in its own way, everything they had already sworn to fight against. "What do you think we should do?" Bell asked, looking to Rexar with the particular trust of someone who had, over these past weeks, come to genuinely value the Beastmaster's judgment. "I think," Rexar said slowly, "this isn't a decision we get to make for them. We go, we listen, and whatever they decide, whether that's to step forward alongside us or to stay hidden a while longer, we respect it, even if it's not the choice we'd have made ourselves. Because the whole point of everything we've been fighting for since Vela and Ilsa is that people get to choose their own path, instead of having it chosen for them by whoever holds the power in the room." He paused, weighing his own next words carefully. "But I won't pretend that's an easy answer, or that it doesn't cost something either way. Sometimes doing right by people means accepting you don't get to make the choice easy for them, even when you want to." Bane's dark eyes carried quiet approval at that, and something more besides, the particular respect of one leader recognizing, in another, the same hard-won wisdom that came only from having faced exactly this kind of impossible choice before, and lived long enough afterward to carry its weight honestly. "Then let us go to them," the tauren chieftain said, "and offer them, at the very least, an honest accounting of what we have seen and chosen, so that whatever they decide it with full and honest knowledge of the world as it now stands." They set out for Telskura 2 days later, a smaller party this time, Rexar, Bane, and Bell, with Fells guiding them through passages toward the settlement's carefully hidden location, leaving Rokan, Lorthamar, Kalia, and Gazlo behind to continue the delicate work of alliance building and fortification that the sanctuary attack had made so urgently necessary. The journey gave Rexar space to think, in the quiet stretches between conversation, about everything the past weeks had revealed. The fragile, hard-won progress at Denatus, the cost of Evilus's attack, the dangerous, patient interest of both Freya and Ishtar, and now this newest complication, a community caught between hope and fear, in ways that mirrored, uncomfortably, his own long history of never quite fitting cleanly on either side of the line the world insisted on drawing. "You've grown quiet again," Bane observed as they walked. "Thinking about how many more of these there are going to be," Rexar admitted. "Communities caught in the same trap, different shapes of it. We can't fight every single one of these fights personally, Bane. There's only 6 of us, and Orario's a big city sitting on top of a very big dungeon." "No," Bane agreed. "We cannot fight every fight personally, but I do not think that is truly what we have been doing these past weeks, however it may sometimes feel that way." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his next words with the same careful deliberation he brought to everything, I think what we have actually been doing, Rexar, is showing this city that the fight is possible at all. That 6 strangers, alone, without any god's blessing, could look at 100 years of careful cruelty and simply refuse to accept it as inevitable. That is not nothing. Even if we cannot personally win every battle this refusal creates, I believe we are teaching this city's own people, Bell and Ween and Vela, and now perhaps Telskura as well, that the fight is theirs to take up as well, once they see it is possible to fight it at all. Bell, walking a step behind them, said nothing, but Rexar caught the quiet, thoughtful weight in the young adventurer's expression. The look, Rexar recognized, of someone turning over the first real shape of the person he might yet become, once this whole strange, dangerous story had run its course. Ahead of them, in the deepening dark of a passage none of Orario's official maps had ever charted, the first faint lights of Telskura's hidden settlement began, cautiously, to flicker into view. One more community, one more impossible choice, waiting at the far end of a road that Rexar understood, with growing and unshakable certainty, was only going to grow longer and more complicated before this story finally found wherever its true ending lay. Telskura's elders received them in the settlement's central longhouse, a modest, timber-framed structure that felt, after weeks spent in the crystal-lit vastness of the dungeon's depths, almost startlingly ordinary, warmed by real hearth fire and the smell of cooking herbs, rather than the strange amber glow of fungal light. The elder who spoke for the gathered council, a weathered woman named Cyril whose features carried, Rexar noted, the faint but unmistakable traces of Xenos heritage in the slight scaling along her jaw and the vertical slit of her pupils, studied the 3 visitors with careful, weighing attention before finally breaking the silence. "You understand," she said, "that we did not survive this long by trusting easily, or by believing that change, however well-intentioned, arrives without cost. We understand," Bane said simply. "We did not come to convince you of anything, Elder Cyril. We came because you asked to hear an honest accounting of what we have seen and chosen, and we felt that honesty owed to your people, whatever you ultimately decide to do with it." Cyril's weathered face carried the ghost of something like relief at that. The particular relief, Rexar recognized, of someone who had expected pressure and instead received respect. "Then tell us plainly," she said, "what has truly changed in Orario since your arrival? Not the rumors, not the hopeful stories already spreading through certain circles. The truth, as you have lived it." Rexar told her, plainly, honestly, laying out the fragile compromise won at Denatus, the cost of Evilus's attack on Weene's sanctuary, the uneasy, transactional alliance now forming with Loki and Hephaestus Familia, the dangerous, patient interest of both Freya and Ishtar, the ongoing resistance from ordinary citizens, who found the whole upheaval threatening rather than hopeful. "So the law has not truly changed," Cyril said when he'd finished. "Only a probationary review has been promised, and the actual danger to your people has, if anything, increased in the short term, even as the long-term hope has grown." "That's the honest shape of it," Rexar confirmed. "I won't pretend it's a simpler or safer story than that, but I think it's a story that's actually moving, for the first time in 100 years, instead of standing still in the same quiet cruelty it stood in for as long as anyone can remember." The council fell into a long, careful deliberation after that, the elders speaking among themselves in a dialect Rexar didn't recognize, weighing decades of hard-won caution against the fragile, uncertain hope the visitors had laid honestly before them. Bell, watching quietly from the longhouse's edge, found himself thinking of Ween's own grief in the aftermath of the sanctuary attack, of her hard-won determination that hope, however costly, remained worth choosing regardless. It was a younger voice, finally, that broke the elders' long deliberation, a woman perhaps Bell's own age, standing at the longhouse's edge, with the particular restless energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for permission to speak. "Elder Cyril," she said, "may I offer a voice, even though I have not yet earned a seat on this council?" Cyril's weathered gaze settled on the young woman, and something almost fond, if still careful, crossed her expression. "Speak, Uni. You have earned the right, I think, whatever the council's formal rules might say." Uni stepped forward, her gaze moving between Rexxar, Bane, and Bell with an intensity that reminded Rexxar, unexpectedly, of Bell's own earnest determination. "I have spent my whole life watching our elders choose caution, again and again, because caution has kept us alive. I do not fault that choice. It has kept us alive, and that is no small thing." She paused, gathering herself. "But I have also watched us grow smaller with every year of that caution. Fewer children born who choose to stay, once they're old enough to understand what hiding costs. Fewer stories told openly, more secrets carried silently to the grave. I do not think caution alone is a future, elders. I think it is only a way of surviving without truly living." Her eyes found Rexxar's. "You said this fight is moving, for the first time in 100 years. I believe you. And I do not want Telskura to still be hiding in the shadows 100 years from now, waiting for someone else's fight to finally make our own choice safe enough to make." The longhouse fell into a weighted, thoughtful silence, and Rexxar watched something shift, visibly, in the careful calculation behind Cyril's weathered eyes. "You speak with more courage than wisdom. Sometimes, Uni," the elder said finally, though there was no real rebuke in it. "But I confess, I have thought much the same, in my quieter hours, and lack the courage to say it plainly before this council." The council's final decision, when it came, was neither the full, open declaration Uni had argued for, nor the continued total secrecy the more cautious elders had initially favored, but a careful middle path. Telskura would send a small delegation, led by Uni herself, to establish quiet, deliberate contact with Oranos's growing coalition, testing the waters of the city's shifting attitude, without committing the whole settlement to a risk it was not yet ready to bear collectively. "It is not the boldness you might have hoped for," Cyril told Rexxar, as the visit drew to its close, "but it is more than we would have offered a month ago, before your arrival gave us reason to believe such boldness might, eventually, prove survivable, rather than merely reckless." "It's enough," Rexxar said, and meant it. "Change that moves at the pace people can actually survive tends to hold a lot better than change forced faster than anyone's ready for. I've seen both kinds, on my own world. The slower kind holds." They returned to Knossos 2 days later, to find the party's careful rhythm of alliance building disrupted by news that had arrived in their absence. Grim, urgent, and considerably more alarming than anything Evilus's earlier sanctuary raid had suggested. "Loki Familia's scouts found something," Rokon said, meeting them at the entrance with a tension in his posture that told Rexxar plainly this was no minor development. "Deep excavation, way below anything Orario's ever charted. Evilus been building something down Dere, something big. Finn thinks it's a staging ground. For what exactly, nobody's sure yet. But whatever it is, it's got Evilus's whole operation in this region working toward it, coordinated in a way that cultist leader you fought at De Sanctuary was clearly just one small piece of." "How big are we talking?" Bane asked. "Big enough that Loki's pulled in reinforcements from her own Familia's deep floor specialists just to keep watching it safely," Rokon said grimly. "And Dere's more. Word from Fells. This whole operation's got a name attached to it now, not just Evilus in general. Somebody specific is running this, somebody with enough authority that even Enyo's more senior agents are deferring to dem." "Who?" Rexxar asked, though something in his chest already anticipated the weight of the answer before Rokon gave it. "Fells calls her the Fallen Star," Rokon said. one of Evilus's oldest and most dangerous fallen deities, a goddess who turned from the guild's side generations ago, and who's been operating in the city's deepest shadows ever since. If she's the one directing this build-up personally, the one ever Evilus is planning, it ain't just another raid like the one on Wine's sanctuary. His dark eyes carried grim, unmistakable weight. This is something a whole lot bigger, and I don't think we got much time left before we find out exactly what. The party gathered that evening in tense, urgent council. The fragile, hopeful momentum of Telskura's cautious first steps toward openness suddenly, sharply overshadowed by the looming, uncertain weight of a threat considerably larger than anything they had yet faced. Oranos, informed of the development by urgent message, arrived within the hour, his ancient, weathered features carrying a gravity that Rexar had not yet seen from the old god, even across the considerable weight of everything they'd already faced together. The fallen star, Oranos said, once the fuller shape of Loki Familia's discovery had been laid before him, is not merely another of Evilus's agents. She is old, and she is patient, and she has spent longer than any of us in this room have been alive nursing a grudge against this city's gods that predates even my own long exile. If she has taken personal interest in your arrival, and in the growing coalition your presence has begun to build, the god paused, weighing his next words with visible care, then I believe we are no longer merely defending scattered Xenos sanctuaries from opportunistic raids. I believe we are approaching the opening moves of a considerably larger conflict, one that has, perhaps, been building beneath this city's surface for far longer than any of us fully understood, until this very moment. The chamber fell into a heavy, weighing silence, the full scale of what they now faced settling slowly, inexorably across every gathered face. Then we prepare, Rexar said finally, breaking the silence with the same steady, unflinching resolve that had carried the party through every impossible choice since the rift first tore them from their own world. Whatever this fallen star is building down there, whatever she's planning, we don't wait for her to finish it and strike on her own timeline. We find out exactly what we're facing, and we get every ally we've built these past weeks ready to stand together when it comes. Bane's low rumble of agreement followed, and Rokan's and Bell's quiet, determined nod alongside them. The whole fragile, hard-won coalition the party had spent weeks carefully building now facing, for the first time, the true shape of the storm that had, perhaps, been gathering beneath Orario's careful, century-old certainties, since long before 6 strangers ever fell through a tear in the world, and chose, without hesitation, exactly which side of this city's oldest lie they intended to stand against. The staging ground Loki Familia's scouts had found lay beneath a stretch of the dungeon that even Finn Damna, who had, across his considerable career, personally charted more previously unknown territory than perhaps any other adventurer in Orario's history, admitted he'd had no prior indication existed at all. "It's not on any map," Finn said, laying out the rough survey his scouts had managed to compile before the operation's own defenses had forced a careful retreat. Not the guilds, not Loki Familia's private records, not even the older, half-legendary charts some of the deep-floor veterans still swear by. Whatever this is, it's been built somewhere the dungeon itself seems to actively conceal. "That fits," Fells said grimly, studying the survey with the particular careful attention of someone cross-referencing it against knowledge few others in the room possessed. Knossos' original builders left more than one hidden fold in the dungeon's deeper architecture, spaces that exist, in a sense, slightly outside the layers most adventurers ever chart. If the fallen star has claimed one of these folds for her own purposes, it would explain how an operation of this scale has gone undetected for as long as it evidently has. Rexar studied the survey's rough sketches, vast chambers, strange mechanisms whose purpose the scouts hadn't been able to determine before retreating. And at the excavation's center, a structure that even the crude rendering managed to convey an unsettling sense of scale and purpose about. "What's she building it for?" he asked. "I do not know with certainty," Oranos admitted. "But I have my suspicions, and I do not offer them lightly." The fallen star was, before her fall, a goddess of considerable ambition regarding the boundary between the divine and mortal worlds. Theories about forcibly widening the gate between realms, about drawing power directly from sources beyond what any mortal Falna was ever meant to channel safely. His weathered face carried old, careful weight. If she has spent this long, in secret, building toward exactly that ambition, then I fear what she intends is nothing so simple as another raid on a Xenos sanctuary. I fear she intends something considerably more catastrophic, an attempt to tear open, deliberately and at scale, the same kind of breach between worlds that brought the six of you here entirely by accident. The chamber went very quiet at that. "You're saying she wants to open more rifts," Bell said slowly, working through the implication. "On purpose. Bigger ones." "I am saying," Oranos said, "that 6 beings of considerable uncatalogued power fell through an accidental tear in the world and immediately proved capable of felling a broodmother in a single stroke, of standing against Evilus's trained agents, of shifting this entire city's careful century-old certainties within a matter of weeks. If the fallen star witnessed that, and drew the obvious, terrible conclusion that deliberately, controllably opening such breaches might grant her access to power and allies capable of finally overturning this city's divine order entirely, then I believe we may have inadvertently provided her with both the proof of concept and the motivation to attempt something she might otherwise never have dared." Rexar felt the weight of that settle heavy and uncomfortable across his chest. The possibility, however unintended, that their own arrival might have set in motion the very catastrophe now gathering beneath Orario's streets. "That's not on us," Bane said quietly, seeming to read the direction of Rexar's thoughts. "We did not choose to arrive here, and we did not choose what a fallen goddess decided to do with the knowledge of our arrival. We are responsible for our own choices, Rexar, not for every twisted conclusion others might draw from them." "Doesn't make it sit any easier," Rexar admitted. "No," Bane agreed. "It rarely does. But dwelling on what we cannot undo serves no one, least of all the people still counting on us to face what comes next." The days that followed brought a new, sharper urgency to the Coalition's preparations. Loki Familia's scouts pushing deeper, more carefully, toward the edges of the fallen star's staging ground, mapping what defenses and forces guarded it without triggering open confrontation before the Coalition was ready. Hephaestus Familia's smiths working double shifts alongside Gazlo to complete the fortified defenses the sanctuary attack had made so urgently necessary, and Uranos, working through fells, reaching out with careful, unprecedented directness to Familias, who had, until now, remained cautiously neutral in the whole unfolding situation. It was during this tense, urgent stretch that Kalia finally kept her promised meeting with Freya, a private audience within Freya Familia's grand manor that the whole party awaited, with no small degree of anxious anticipation, until her return late that evening. Rexar asked, the moment she reappeared, unable to fully mask his relief at her safe return alongside his genuine curiosity about what had passed between her and the notoriously dangerous goddess. "She is not what I expected," Kalia admitted, settling near the fire with an expression more thoughtful than troubled. "I anticipated manipulation, pressure, the kind of predatory courtship Otar's warnings had led me to brace for. Instead, I found a goddess, genuinely, deeply curious about the nature of my magic, about what it means to reclaim power that was once turned toward death and violence, and remake it into something closer to mercy. She asked more questions about my history, my choices, my reasoning, than about my power itself. Callia's pale features carried a complicated weight. I do not fully trust her, and I do not think I ever fully will. Otar's warnings about her patience and her appetite for beautiful, powerful things were not, I think, exaggerated. But I no longer believe her interest in me is merely possessive. I believe it is, in its own complicated way, genuine. And did she ask again? Bane said carefully. About your loyalty? She did not, Callia said, which surprised me more than anything else about the whole encounter. I think, perhaps, Otar's earlier assurance was more honest than I initially credited it. She does not appear to want what is not given freely. A faint, wry note entered her voice. Though I would not go so far as to call her patient courtship entirely abandoned either. I suspect this will not be our last such conversation, as long as it stays a conversation, and nothing more coerced than that, Rexar said. I won't stand in the way of it. It was 2 days later, in the quiet hours before the Coalition's forces were set to begin their first careful, coordinated push toward properly mapping the Fallen Star's operation, that the true scale of the danger they faced revealed itself in a manner none of them had anticipated. Veen arrived at Knossos' quarters in a state of barely controlled alarm, breathless from a hurried journey up from her sanctuary. Bilsa is missing, she said, before anyone could ask what had brought her running. Vela sent word. She went to gather fungal light near the deep's outer edge, as she has done 100 times before, and did not return. Vela's searching now, but Rexar's blood went cold with an intensity that surprised even himself. The particular fierce, protective fear of a beastmaster who had spent weeks watching a small serpentine child slowly, cautiously learn to trust him and his companions after a lifetime of learning the opposite lesson from the world around her. That's not a child wandering off, he said, already reaching for his axe. That cultist leader I fought at the sanctuary, he said tonight, was about learning what it cost to make us bleed. If the Fallen Star's people took Ilse, then it is exactly the kind of leverage a patient, ambitious goddess would use to draw 6 powerful strangers directly into a trap of her own choosing. Bane finished grimly, already moving toward the door alongside him. We must move quickly, but carefully, Rexar. If this is a trap, walking into it blind serves no one, least of all Ilse. Then we don't walk in blind, Rexar said, already striding toward the passage that led down toward the deep, Misha surging ahead of him with a low, urgent growl that spoke plainly of her own fierce protectiveness toward the small serpentine child she'd grown fond of across these past weeks. But we walk in fast. Whatever the Fallen Star wants from taking her, I'm not giving her the time to get it. Behind them, the fragile, hard-won coalition's careful, methodical preparations gave way, in an instant, to something rawer and more urgent, the whole party rallying with the fierce, unhesitating speed of people who had, across these past weeks, come to understand precisely what it meant to protect something worth protecting, regardless of the cost that protection might demand. And far below, in the hidden, unmapped fold of the dungeon where the Fallen Star's ambitions had been quietly, patiently taking shape for longer than any of them yet understood, a small serpentine child sat frightened and alone in a cell of cold stone, entirely unaware that her disappearance had just set in motion the exact confrontation that would determine, once and for all, the true shape of the storm gathering beneath Orario's careful, century-old certainties. They tracked Ilsa's trail to the edge of the hidden fold within hours, Rokan's hunter instincts and Fels's intimate knowledge of Knossos' concealed architecture combining to locate, faster than any of them had dared hope, the precise seam in the dungeon's deeper stone where the Fallen Star's staging ground lay hidden from the wider world. This is where Loki's scouts pulled back, Fels said quietly, studying the strange, shimmering distortion in the passage ahead, a fold in reality itself, subtle enough that untrained eyes would have walked past it without ever noticing the wrongness. Beyond this point, We move entirely outside whatever protection the Coalition's wider forces can offer us. If this is a trap, as Bane suspects, it will close around us the moment we cross this threshold. Then we cross it carefully, Rexar said. But we cross it. I'm not leaving that child in there one moment longer than we have to. They moved through the fold together. Rexar, Bane, Rokan, Kalia, Lorthamar, Fells, and Bell, who had insisted, with a quiet, fierce determination that brooked no argument, on joining the rescue rather than waiting anxiously above. And the world on the fold's far side revealed itself to be exactly as vast and unsettling as the crude survey sketches had suggested, though considerably more alive with activity than anyone had anticipated. Vast chambers stretched away in every direction, threaded with the same corrupted variant of blue crystal light that had marked Evilus's earlier assault on Weena's sanctuary. And at the complex's heart, visible even from this distance, a structure of genuinely staggering scale, some manner of gate or portal, half-built, its incomplete architecture pulsing with barely contained, unstable energy. That, Fells said grimly, is considerably further along than any of us anticipated. They found Ilsa's cell after a tense, careful hour of navigation through the complex's outer edges, avoiding patrols with Rokan's careful guidance and Lorthamar's disciplined precision. A small, cold chamber where the young Xenos sat curled small and frightened, but, to Rexar's fierce relief, entirely unharmed. "Rexar," she said, voice small but steady, the moment she recognized him through the cell's bars. "I knew you would come." "Course I would," Rexar said, already working at the cell's crude lock with the particular focused efficiency of a man who'd broken far sturdier things than this in his time. "Wouldn't be much of a friend if I didn't." It was, of course, precisely at that moment, the cell door swinging open, Ilsa scrambling gratefully into Rexar's arms, that the trap Bane had warned of finally, fully revealed itself. "How touching," said a voice that carried none of the desperate rabble energy of the cultist leader Rexar had fought at the sanctuary, but something older, colder, carrying centuries of patient, calculating ambition behind every syllable. "I confess, I did wonder whether you would come personally, or send lesser agents in your stead. I am pleased to see my assessment of your character proved accurate." She emerged from the shadowed edge of the chamber with an unhurried, terrible grace. Tall, pale, her features carrying the unmistakable, unsettling beauty of a fallen divinity, robed in dark fabric that seemed to drink in the chamber's corrupted light, rather than reflect it. The fallen star, Rexar understood with cold, immediate certainty, exactly as Fells had described her. "You used a child as bait," Rexar said, voice low and dangerous. Ilsa held protectively against his chest. "That's the kind of enemy you are then." "I used a child as an invitation," the fallen star corrected, unbothered by the accusation. "There is a difference, though I imagine it matters little to you in this moment. I wish to speak with you directly, Beastmaster, and I judged, correctly it seems, that a more conventional invitation would not have received your prompt attention." "Then speak," Bane said, stepping forward, staff already shifting into a defensive readiness. "And speak quickly, because I do not believe any of us intend to remain in your company one moment longer than necessary." "Very well." The fallen star's cold, ancient eyes swept across the gathered party with open, calculating appraisal. "I have watched your arrival with considerable interest these past weeks. 6 beings of uncatalogued power, owing no allegiance to any god in this pitiful, blessing-obsessed city, capable of shifting a century of careful divine order within mere weeks of your arrival. I confess, I found myself asking an obvious question. What might be possible if such power could be drawn here deliberately, at scale, rather than by mere accident? You want to tear open more rifts, Rexar said. Bring more of us through, on purpose. I want, the fallen star said, to finally overturn a divine order that has kept this city's true potential shackled for a century, hoarded by the same tired gods who have grown fat and complacent on mortal worship, while pretending their blessing is the only measure of worth a being might possess. You six have proven, more effectively than I could have engineered myself, precisely how fragile that order truly is. I intend to finish what your arrival began, deliberately, and at a scale that will leave no possibility of this city's old certainties ever fully recovering. And you thought, Kalia said, something cold and dangerous entering her usually composed voice, that we would help you accomplish this, after you stole a child to force the conversation. I thought, the fallen star said, that you might listen to reason once the conversation was actually offered. But I confess, I did not expect agreement so much as I expected understanding, that you, of all beings in this city, might recognize a kindred frustration with divine order, built on arbitrary lines of worth. I am disappointed, though not entirely surprised, to find you so thoroughly captured already by this city's more comfortable illusions of righteousness. You don't know the first thing about us, Rexar said. If you think stealing a child and threatening to tear the world open is anything close to the fight we've been fighting since we arrived. We didn't come here to burn down every system that's ever wronged someone. We came here to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's not the same fight as yours, and I think you know it, or you wouldn't have needed to steal a child to get our attention in the first place. Something flickered across the fallen star's cold, ancient features. Not quite anger, but something colder and more dangerous adjacent to it. Then I suppose, she said, we have nothing further to discuss through words alone. The chamber erupted into motion. The fight that followed was unlike anything the party had faced since their arrival. The fallen star herself, proving a genuinely formidable opponent, her fallen divinity granting her power that dwarfed anything the cultist leader at the sanctuary had wielded. Corrupted magic tearing through the chamber with devastating, near uncontrollable force, even as her summoned guards poured in from the complex's outer passages to reinforce her. Rexar fought with Ilsa still cradled protectively against him for the fight's first desperate minutes, until Bell, moving with a speed and determination that spoke to how far the young adventurer had genuinely grown across these past weeks, fought his way close enough to take the terrified child into his own protective grip, freeing Rexar's hands for the full weight of the battle now unfolding around them. "Get her clear," Rexar bellowed, already turning his full attention back to the fallen star's advancing guards. Bell nodded once, already retreating with Ilsa toward the chamber's edge, and the rest of the party closed ranks around Rexar, with the practiced, hard-won coordination of weeks spent fighting together. Bane's earth magic disrupting the guards' formation, Rokan's shadow blades finding gaps in their coordination, Lorthamar's precise, relentless arrows thinning their numbers from a careful elevated position, Kalia's reclaimed light, burning through corrupted flesh, even as she worked to counter the worst of the fallen star's more devastating magic. It was a desperate, grueling fight, the fallen star's raw power forcing the party into a defensive, reactive posture entirely unlike their usual forward-driving momentum, until, in the fight's most dangerous moment, as the fallen star turned the full weight of her corrupted power directly toward Rexar in a strike that would, by every indication, have proven devastating even to his considerable durability, a new voice cut across the chamber, sharp and unexpected, and carrying an authority that gave even the fallen star's cold confidence a moment's genuine pause. "That," said Otar, arriving through the chamber's outer passage with a speed that spoke to exactly how seriously Freya's warrior had taken Loki Familia's earlier warnings about the scale of what the coalition now faced, "will not be happening today." He was not alone. Behind him, moving with the same brutal, disciplined efficiency that had made her Familia's warband the stuff of legend across Orario, a contingent of Loki Familia's strongest fighters poured into the chamber. Finn's voice already ringing out crisp commands that turned the tide of the battle's numbers decisively, in the space of moments, against the fallen star's remaining guards. "You are not the only one capable of watching and waiting, fallen star," Otar said, planting himself directly between the goddess and Rexar's party with an immovable, unhurried confidence. "Loki Familia has tracked this operation for the better part of a week. We simply required confirmation of its full scale before committing our full strength against it. I believe you have now provided that confirmation rather thoroughly." The fallen star's cold composure faltered, for the first time, into something genuinely uncertain, her ancient eyes sweeping across the chamber's rapidly shifting balance of power, with visible, calculating recalculation. "This changes nothing of my ultimate intent," she said, though something in her voice carried, for the first time, the edge of genuine strain. "You have delayed me. You have not stopped me." "Maybe not today," Rexar said, rising from where the fallen star's earlier strike had driven him to one knee, axe still steady in his grip, despite the considerable damage he'd taken. "But you tipped your hand today, and now the whole city knows exactly what you're building down here, and exactly how far you're willing to go to build it. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of your ending, whether it comes today or not." The fallen star studied him for a long, weighing moment, and then, with the particular cold, calculated grace of a being who understood precisely when a battle was no longer winnable, began a careful, deliberate retreat toward the chamber's deeper passages, her remaining forces covering the withdrawal with disciplined precision. "This is not finished," she said, as the shadows swallowed her retreating form. "You have won a single battle, Beastmaster. The war beneath this city's careful, comfortable order has only just begun." And then she was gone, leaving behind a chamber littered with the aftermath of battle, a half-built gate still pulsing with unstable, dangerous energy, and a party of exhausted, battered allies who understood, with grim and unshakable clarity, that whatever peace they had won this day was only ever going to prove temporary. The half-built gate could not simply be abandoned. Uranus was plain about that much. Once the Coalition's forces had secured the staging ground in the exhausted, urgent hours following the fallen star's retreat, left unstable, its corrupted energy would eventually tear open on its own, uncontrolled and catastrophic, potentially far worse than anything the fallen star herself might have deliberately unleashed. "We have perhaps a handful of days before the instability reaches critical threshold," Fells reported, having spent the better part of a sleepless night studying the gate's strange architecture, alongside Gazlo, whose engineering instincts had proven, against every expectation, genuinely essential to understanding a structure built on principles no living scholar in Orario had ever encountered. Whether it collapses safely or catastrophically will depend entirely on how carefully and how quickly we can dismantle it. "Then we dismantle it," Rexar said, "together, whatever that takes." What followed was neither combat nor diplomacy, but something Rexar found, in its own quiet way, more genuinely hopeful than either. The full coalition they'd spent weeks carefully building, finally standing shoulder to shoulder in shared, urgent purpose. Loki Familia's warriors held the perimeter against the fallen star's scattered remaining forces, still probing and testing but no longer capable of mounting a coordinated counterattack. Hephaestus Familia's smiths, working directly alongside Gazlo, forged the specialized containment tools the gate's careful dismantling required. Ganesha Familia coordinated the delicate work of evacuating and stabilizing the wider dungeon region against the gate's continued instability. And at the center of it all, Xenos and Horde and human adventurers worked side by side, Asterius's people lending their intimate knowledge of the dungeon's deeper currents, Vela and the Deep's community providing careful watch over the vulnerable evacuees. Wine and Bell coordinating between every disparate group with a tireless, determined grace that spoke to exactly how far both of them had grown across these transformative weeks. Otar worked beside Rexar through much of the tense, grueling effort, and in a rare quiet moment as they helped brace a section of the gate's outer frame against premature collapse, the massive warrior offered something Rexar hadn't quite expected. "Lady Freya sends her genuine respect," Otar said. "Not merely her curiosity this time. You have shown this city something it desperately needed to see, whatever cost that showing demanded of you. I do not say this lightly, Beastmaster. I have served Freya Familia for a very long time, and I have rarely seen her genuinely respect anything, let alone anyone, quite this quickly." "Tell her I appreciate it," Rexar said, "even if I'm still not looking to be won over by it." Otar's broad face carried the faint ghost of something like amusement. "I would expect nothing less. I believe that, more than anything else, is precisely what earned it." The gate's dismantling took the better part of 3 days, grueling and dangerous work that tested every ounce of the Coalition's hard-won cooperation, and when the last unstable fragment of corrupted energy finally, safely dispersed into harmless dust, the exhausted cheer that rose through the staging ground's ruined chambers carried a weight far beyond mere relief. It carried, Rexar understood, watching Xenos and adventurers and strangers from another world alike embracing amid the wreckage of a threat they had faced and overcome together, something closer to the first genuine, unmistakable proof that the fragile, uncertain hope this whole strange story had been built upon might actually prove capable of holding. Uranos convened a final Denatus session 2 weeks later, not urgent this time, but deliberate, carefully prepared, the ancient god finally, fully stepping into the open advocacy he had spent a century too afraid to attempt alone. The debate that followed was neither quick nor entirely without resistance. Old prejudice, Rexar had learned across these past weeks, rarely surrendered easily or completely, and there remained gods and familias in that chamber who argued, still, for caution, for delay, for half measures that fell well short of the full, honest reckoning the Xenos' long-hidden existence genuinely deserved. But the vote, when it finally came, passed, not unanimously, not without hard-fought compromise, but decisively enough that Orario's century-old laws regarding the treatment of sentient, thinking beings born from the dungeon's depths would, for the first time in the city's long history, begin the slow, careful process of genuine, structural change. Vina wept, quietly, when the news reached her, and Rexar found himself, for once, entirely without any of the steady, practical words that had carried him and his companions through every impossible choice since the rift first tore them from their own world. "You did this," she said, when she finally found her voice again. "You and your companions. You did what I never believed I would live to see." "We didn't do it alone," Rexar said gently. "You did plenty of it yourself, long before we ever fell into this world. Bell did plenty of it too, and Vela, and Asterius, and Uni back in Telskura, and every single person who chose to keep hoping, even when hoping cost them something. We just helped tip a scale that was already closer to moving than any of you gave yourselves credit for." "Perhaps," Wien said, "but I do not think it would have tipped, not truly, not this soon, without 6 strangers willing to stand in the open and refuse to look away." She studied him for a long, quiet moment. "What happens now? Will you stay and see this new world through to whatever it eventually becomes?" Rexar considered the question, turning it over with the same careful weight he'd given every major choice since arriving in this strange, transformed world. "I don't know yet," he admitted honestly. "Part of me still thinks about home, about Azeroth, about whether there's ever a way back, about whether we're needed there just as badly as we've been needed here. But I know this much for certain. Whatever we decide, This fight isn't finished. The fallen star's still out there somewhere, still planning whatever comes next. Freya and Ishtar haven't stopped watching us either, and there's a whole city full of people still learning, slowly, what it actually means to change 100 years of belief. He looked around at the gathered coalition. Bane's quiet, steady gravity, Rokan's sharp, watchful readiness, Kalia's complicated, hard-won grace, Lorthamar's disciplined resolve, Gazlo's tireless, inventive enthusiasm, Bell's earnest, growing courage, Ween's fierce, hopeful determination, and felt something settle, finally, fully certain in his chest. But I think, for now at least, this is exactly where we're meant to be. The city above did not transform overnight. Prejudice, as Rexxar had told Bell weeks before, rarely surrendered all at once, and in the months that followed the gate's dismantling and Denatus's hard-won vote, Orario continued the slow, uneven, genuinely difficult work of becoming something better than the century of careful cruelty it had built itself upon. Some citizens embraced the change with open, grateful relief. Others resisted it bitterly, clinging to old certainties even as the ground shifted decisively beneath them. The fallen star remained at large, her ultimate ambitions unfulfilled but far from abandoned, a shadow still gathering somewhere in the dungeon's deeper, unmapped dark. Freya's patient interest, and Ishtar's considerably less patient one, continued unabated, two storms of their own kind still waiting on some distant horizon. But in the deep, Ilse grew a little taller, a little braver, no longer flinching at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps. In Telskura, Uni's cautious delegation grew, slowly, into something like genuine, hopeful partnership. In Twilight Manor, Bell Cranel carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had finally stopped hiding the truest, best part of who he'd always been. And beneath Orario's gleaming streets, 6 strangers from a world none of its people would ever fully understand continued, day by day, choice by choice, the long and unfinished work of proving that the line between person and monster had never truly been where this city's old laws once claimed it stood. Rexxar stood at the edge of the deep one evening, Misha warm and steady at his side, watching the slow, patient drift of blue motes across an impossible ceiling he had, somewhere across these transformative weeks, without quite realizing it, begun to call home. Whatever storms still waited beyond this fragile, hard-won peace, and he did not doubt, for a moment, that more were coming. He found himself facing them not with dread, but with the same steady, unhesitating resolve that had carried him and his companions through everything since the moment a rift first tore open beneath their feet. They had not chosen this world, but they had chosen, entirely and without regret, exactly what they would become within it. And that, Rexxar thought, watching Ilse's small shape dart playfully between the settlement's carved dwellings below, laughing in a way she never could have, once, was more than enough reason to stay and see the rest of this story through, to whatever ending it was still, patiently, waiting to find.